Chapter 201. The Great War Begins. To say that the world was on the verge of being lit aflame after the assassination of the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife was no exaggeration. In Bruno's previous life, the Habsburg dynasty sent a list of demands to the Kingdom of Serbia, including the matter of an international investigation into the murder of their heir apparent. There was a common misconception that Serbia had agreed to all of these demands except for one, which was the one that would give up their sovereignty as a nation, choosing instead to fight to remain an independent kingdom. The reality was that the ultimatum, which put Serbian sovereignty into question, was the demand that Austria be allowed to conduct a bilateral and international investigation into the assassination of their heir. Why would Serbia reject such a request? The answer was threefold. Russia had told them in advance that they would back the Serbian army no matter what happened, and had already begun to mobilize their forces for this effort. France had also told Russia they would back them no matter what, and communications were already being held on how to win the war before the deadline for this ultimatum was reached. And thirdly, Serbia could never allow this last point of the six-point ultimatum, which was intended to de-escalate the situation before it turned into war, because their own intelligence agencies had supplied the assassins with the weapons, training, and safe houses to conduct the attack. They knew for a fact that they were guilty, and this revelation would damn them in the eyes of their potential allies. So it was better to drag the world into war than to be obliterated by the combined might of Austria-Hungary and the German Reich. When combined with the fact that the German parliament had given Austria-Hungary a blank check to do as they pleased while the Kaiser was on vacation, this compounded into the start of the Great War, which led to the destruction of Western civilization. This was not, however, how things had proceeded in this timeline. Austria-Hungary was, of course, sending a similar series of demands almost immediately after diplomatic exchanges had begun. Meanwhile, Bruno stood in the Kaiser's palace along with the rest of his general staff, each of whom had an opinion on the matter. While the Kaiser did not have the means to approve an offensive, the man was still being informed of what was happening, and Bruno intended to be the devil on his shoulder. Thus, while the other generals were arguing over the matter, Bruno was leaning against the wall at the back of the room, entirely unfazed as he smoked a cigarette. Once he had finished the tobacco contained within the device, he stamped it out on a nearby ashtray before speaking, and when he did, everyone became silent. We all knew that this day would come sooner or later. Is this not the reason we have spent the last decade preparing for such an eventuality? There is only one solution. There must be war. God himself has willed at the moment he deemed fit to permit the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The French and the British have thrown their lot in with the Serbians. The time has come for the great European war, as we were warned decades ago. So be it. We will fight this war, and when we win, there will be a new order to the world. It is the dawn of a new era, gentlemen. A German era. After saying this, Bruno walked away from the meeting. He had said what he needed to say, and like the devil on the Kaiser's shoulder, approval for funding would be granted, and the army would be mobilized. It was the same in every country when a man told his family that he was leaving for war, going forth to wave a banner on some foreign earth. Tears were shed, hugs were given, and prayers were chanted. Bruno's departure for the Balkans was no different. Heidi, and all of the children she had together with Bruno, were more than dispirited about their father's departure. Some of them were old enough to remember when he marched off to Russia. In that war, he returned a valiant hero, gaining a title of hereditary nobility for them all within the Russian Empire. But this was not the same. Bruno's older children, among whom his oldest daughter Eva was already nearing her 13th birthday, understood well enough that this was a different matter. This was not some petty civil war fought in the frozen wastelands of Russia between a ragtag group of Marxist rebels and the Russian army. This was a war fought between the world's great powers. Nearly a month had passed since the July crisis began, and the declarations of war had been made. Italy, France, Great Britain, Serbia, the Ottoman Empire, and several other Balkan states such as Montenegro were the initial members of the Allied powers. Relations between the German Reich and the British Empire had deteriorated so much in this timeline that there was no need for the British to wait for a violation of Belgian neutrality. They had promised France full support in years prior for any war fought against the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. Naturally, they intended to honor this allegiance. As for the Central Powers, they had been replaced in this life by what was known as the Imperial Powers. It was an alliance consisting of 4 empires: the German Reich, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Empire of Japan. Other minor powers that had joined the major alliances in Bruno's past life, such as Bulgaria, Romania, Greece, Siam, the United States, etc., were all currently neutral. Having previously mobilized their combined forces to the Serbian border a year prior during the Second Balkan War, the 3 European empires were quick to do just that. They already had extensive experience in this regard. Because of this, nearly 2 million men were sent straight toward the Kingdom of Serbia, and it took them less than a month to do so, with full mobilization beginning the moment the Archduke of Austria and his wife were assassinated. Operational command for the Balkan campaign was given to General Feldmarschall August von Mackensen, who led the German 11th Army. Along with him, Bruno and his 8th Army were dispatched to the region. This army group also included the Austro-Hungarian 4th and 5th Armies, as well as the Russian 1st and 2nd Armies. Meaning at the official outbreak of war, 1.8 million men representing the 3 European empires of the imperial powers marched into Serbia, and hell came with them. Chapter 202. First Contact with the Enemy. Bruno often had a grim sense of humor, and that humor manifested itself as the opening shots were exchanged between the punitive expedition consisting of the 1.8 million men belonging to the army group dispatched into Serbia and the Serbian army defending against their onslaught. Bruno stood among his soldiers, or more specifically the command staff in the rear echelon, as he gazed upon the explosions detonating with each passing second. The sound of machine gun fire echoed along with artillery, and the screams of the wounded created a symphony of death. All the while, Bruno smoked another cigarette and spoke his thoughts on it all. I was curious if history would remember me as the man who made such great preparations for this moment, only to be the first to fall in battle by a stray bullet. Truly ironic, wouldn't it be? Eric chuckled at Bruno's remarks, finding the man's grim sense of humor aligned with his own. In preparation for this war, he had resigned from his position as the director of the Kaiser's reformed secret police and re-enlisted. Granted his old commission, the man now served as Bruno's personal adjutant. Meanwhile, Heinrich, who continued to serve as a colonel, was also nearby to witness Bruno's poor attempt at a joke about his own mortality. He shook his head and sighed, speaking with an almost exhausted tone in his voice. Sometimes I wonder if all the wars you fought have done something to your brain. You really should see a doctor about that sooner or later. Bruno simply shrugged his shoulders, a silent dismissal of his friend's concern. Watching an artillery shell explode in the distance, he pointed to it as he exhaled a large plume of smoke from his lungs, seemingly indifferent to the life lost in that moment as he commented on the scale of artillery. I see the 210s are being used to greater effect than I initially thought they would. How much do you want to bet the enemy army capitulates by the end of the day? The first battle of the war began at the Serbian border between the German 8th Army and the Serbian 2nd and 3rd Armies. Wanting to seize Belgrade and knock the Serbians out of the war by the year's end, Bruno made a bold advance into the region, while the other imperial armies sent to the campaign did so from various other entry points at the borders they shared with Serbia. Serbia, of course, was not expecting such a swift advance by the German 8th Army. But to be fair, the Germans were supported by extensive railway infrastructure and a logistics network of trucks, while supplied by Russian oil. The rest of the world was relying on horses and carriages to support their logistical networks, while the German army was supported by motorized means. The speed with which they could advance was significantly greater than that of their rivals. So much so that the Serbians were not expecting immediate contact with the enemy, let alone 300,000 of them, supported by heavy artillery. To compare how disadvantaged the Serbians were in this invasion, they had only managed to mobilize 450,000 men by the start of the war, whereas the combined imperial powers had brought with them 1.8 million, many of whom were equipped with extremely modern weapons. Even if Serbia had its own Alexander leading their forces, which they did not, merely protecting their own capital from such an overwhelming invasion force encroaching on multiple fronts was a daunting task, to say the least. At the outbreak of the war, half of the Serbian Royal Army had come into contact with just one of 6 field armies deployed into their territory. Despite this, the Serbians were the ones who were numerically disadvantaged. Bruno had advanced so quickly and deployed his troops in such a rapid manner that they had managed to capture half of all of Serbia's military forces currently mobilized in an encirclement. The Serbian troops were caught in interconnecting lines of fire and were being cut to ribbons by the overwhelming firepower the Germans were able to lay down upon them. All the while, Bruno watched from a safe distance, cracking jokes at his own expense and those of the men being killed by his soldiers. Needless to say, at the moment, things were going exactly as Bruno had planned, but for how long they would? Only God knew the answer to that question. While Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary had split the majority of their forces along the borders of the Balkan and Italian theaters, Germany had left 2 field armies to cover their western front. With the fortifications built and the overwhelming advantage they had in terms of firepower, this was more than enough to defend the German border and still not cede an inch of ground against the French onslaught. Yes, I said the French onslaught, because at the outbreak of war, British transport ships carrying thousands of soldiers inexplicably found themselves being sunk in the North Sea. Nobody knew how the Germans were doing it. One moment these ships were en route to their destination, and the next, all contact had been lost. But the British had yet to land a single soldier on French soil to support the war effort, and they had sent over 10,000 men to the depths of the sea trying. Because of this, the French army was forced to assault the German fortifications without support, especially after hearing about the initial contact made between the Serbian and German armies at the border, one that had the potential to eliminate Serbia within the first month of the war if France did not force the Germans to divert some of their forces. Because of this, Leon had been sent to try and capture Alsace-Lothringen for France, a major point of contention they had with Germany since losing it in 1871. The French general was confident that he and his men would break through the German defenses. There was just one thing he wasn't expecting: German technological superiority. Whether it was sniper rifles, long-range artillery, mobile mortars, or close air support aircraft, every time the French tried to set up their field guns, the men operating them would be hit by some form of hostile force. The Germans had an uncanny ability to instantly detect French forces trying to set up heavy weaponry and take them out within moments of being spotted. This was, of course, due to the significant investments in wireless communications Bruno had made in preparation for the war. When scouts in armored cars could advance into enemy lines undetected and report to the artillery where the enemy was setting up their mortars and howitzers, it didn't take much more than a single, precise bombardment to take care of the problem before it manifested itself. And that was currently the role German armored cars played. Given sloped rolled homogeneous armor, a 20mm autocannon as a primary weapon, a max speed of 90 km per hour on roads, along with both camouflage paint and netting, these motorized reconnaissance units would require a direct hit from an artillery piece to be damaged by the French forces. But the French would have to spot them first, and that was assuming the French artillery could hit the German armored scouts before they could off-road out of the area of impact. In other words, Germany had the ability to completely deter any French attack with significant enough destructive power to damage their fortifications before it even began. And it was driving Leon absolutely mad, as the man stared into the distance while shouting commands at his troops, trying his best not to lose his cool and insult them. Then attack the enemy fortifications with your machine guns. I don't give a damn about the casualties. If we do not break through here, then there will be serious consequences for us all. Do you understand me? The result of this poorly planned attack, which lacked both heavy firepower and machine guns in support of the advance, would result in perhaps one of the most significant numbers of casualties in a single battle that the world had ever seen up until this point. That is, of course, if you don't include the battle that Bruno was currently fighting against the Serbians at the exact same time that Leon commanded his forces to march to their deaths. Chapter 203. Terms for Surrender. Smoke rose in the air, and the bullets ceased to fire a few hours after they had begun. Bruno gazed upon his pocket watch, which carried his family's coat of arms. Or should I say the coat of arms? He was granted permission to fly within the Russian Empire. This coat of arms did not belong to the Prussian Junker House of Zehntner, but rather the Russian princely house of Zehntner. And because of this, Bruno chose his own coat of arms to represent his personal line of succession. The coat of arms was a Russian imperial eagle, with a Totenkopf emblazoned across its chest. This was not the infamous Totenkopf of the SS, which resounded throughout the history of his past life as a controversial symbol. Rather, the earlier variant used by the Freikorps, which just so happened to be the version he utilized during the Russian Civil War for his so-called Iron Division. The distinction between the two symbols was noticeable by the golden, double-headed and crowned eagle, which had the silver skull and crossbones in the center. It was a symbol that reminded him, and all of his future descendants, of how their noble house was founded. At the same time, it made for an intrinsic heirloom when embossed onto the center of a master-crafted pocket watch, one which Bruno used to keep time as the battle came to a sudden stop. The white flag was raised in the distance by what remained of Serbia's forces, and when it was reached into Bruno's line of sight, he closed his pocket watch and called for a cease to all ongoing hostilities. "Hold your fire. The enemy has surrendered." The order rang throughout the lines of communication. Every radio operator heard Bruno's words relayed to them, as they themselves gave the order to their troops to cease firing their weapons. As the bullets ceased flying, eventually a man wearing an officer's uniform within the Serbian Royal Army stepped forward. His exact rank, Bruno, was unsure of, as the distinctive markings that would otherwise let him know were covered with blood, no doubt belonging to someone who had died very close and very violently while next to the officer in question. Nevertheless, this officer bore the white flag of peace and stepped forward to speak with Bruno. In a time of war, even in the rear echelon, Bruno carried at least 2 weapons on him at all times. Currently, he had Mauser C96 Red 9 holstered on his belt. At the same time, he had an MP34 or MP05, as it was known in this timeline, slung around his shoulder. Both had a round chambered and were ready to be fired at a moment's notice if need be. Nevertheless, Bruno approached the Serbian officer with his own personal case of cigarettes in hand. The tobacco inside was grown in colonies abroad and personally processed into the white stick within Bruno's hands by his own employees. The case itself was gold and marked with the same symbol as his pocket watch. Needless to say, it was strange for a German general to have a personal item bearing the Russian imperial eagle upon it. Or so it would have been if this coat of arms had not already become infamous across Europe by now. When the Serbian officer noticed the case which contained the cigarette Bruno offered to him, he immediately understood who he was dealing with, and was surprised that he and his man had been afforded mercy. Generaloberst Bruno von Zehntner. I wish I could say it was a pleasure to meet a man of such high renown, but considering the circumstances, I don't think that would be quite right. Despite the cautious glance he gave towards Bruno, the man still accepting the peace offering, immediately placing the cigarette in his mouth and allowing Bruno to light it for him, where the infamous German general partook of the same gesture immediately thereafter. Once they had both inhaled the nicotine deep within their lungs before letting it out in a large plume of smoke, Bruno asked a question of the officer he was dealing with. "I take it you're the highest-ranking officer who survived this little skirmish, and have therefore come to surrender seeking proper terms." Skirmish? Did Bruno seriously just use the term skirmish? The battle began at approximately 9 in the morning and had concluded just before lunchtime. He had lost 100,000 men in that brief window of time. Even in Bruno's past life at the Somme, such substantial losses had not been had under such limited circumstances. To call this a skirmish was an insult to the men who lie dead, and their families who would ultimately bury what remained of them. This was a complete and total massacre. The Serbians were slaughtered like pigs and given just as much as a fight in return to their gruesome fate. The man was about to respond with hostility when he caught a glimpse of the Totenkopf on Bruno's cigarette case, which he stashed away in one of his coat pockets. In doing so, he was instantly reminded of the ruthless reputation which preceded the man who he had the misfortune of going up against. Instead, he responded to Bruno's question with a silent nod of his head, as well as an exhausted tone in his voice. "Do you mind if I ask you a question before we get on with the formalities?" Bruno continued to smoke his cigarette as both sides cautiously eyed one another. The Germans still surrounded the Serbians on all sides, and were capable of firing upon one another if the circumstances demanded it. These two officers stood alone between their forces, on the ground marred with blood, bone, and ash, all while smoking together and communicating in ways that only they knew. Bruno nodded his head as he responded to the Serbian officer's question with a tone that conveyed his impatience as he did so. "You have that right, but make it quick. I want to make it to Belgrade before the week ends. And Lord knows that taking care of you lot will be a 3-day affair at the latest." This, of course, was related to the question the Serbian officer wanted to ask, and thus he was quick to do so, sounding almost completely befuddled by the question, which when Bruno heard it thought was the most obvious thing in the world. "Why are we still alive? You have a reputation of being ruthless with your prisoners, so the moment I raised the white flag and signaled the intent to surrender, why didn't you just massacre us? Why are you even entertaining my questions now?" Though Bruno was partially insulted by the man's words, he realized he didn't necessarily have that right halfway through the thought. He had acted viciously and inhumanely towards an enemy he thought of as subhuman, and he still had no regrets about that. By now all kinds of rumors had spread about his time in Russia, which was his last foray into the battlefield, and thus it was understanding that those ignorant of the reason why he had behaved so monstrously to the Red Army in Russia were not to blame for their misunderstanding. Instead, Bruno made his reasons for sparing them abundantly clear as he pointed towards the tattered banners in the distance, which bore the pride and prestige of the Serbian royal family, and in doing so answered the question that the officers sought an answer to. "Why? You're the king's men, are you not? As far as I'm aware, you and I, nor any of the men beneath your command share any past enmity between us. And since you fight for the honor and glory of your king, why should I treat you like a rabid dog in need of being put down? I mean, you're not a Marxist, are you?" What Bruno had said was enough to convince the Serbian officer that he had been wrong about Bruno, and thus he was quick to surrender, knowing that to continue to fight even against such overwhelming odds would only lead to certain death for him and his men. "You offer your terms, I have none." Bruno was quick to offer his terms, which were far greater than the Serbian officer was expecting. "I will guarantee you and your man safe passage to Sarajevo, where you will be fed and housed in accordance with the rules of war. And when this dreadful conflict finally comes to an end, you will be released without any form of retribution acted upon you. From there you are free to do as you wish, as you will no longer be our prisoners of war. Are these terms acceptable in condition for your surrender and disarmament?" To say that the Serbian officer was not expecting such graceful terms was an understatement, especially when the man thought he was dealing with the devil himself. He was quick to agree to Bruno's terms as he returned to his men and ordered their immediate disarmament and surrender. By the time the prisoners were all loaded up on the trucks and transported back to Sarajevo, Bruno would reunite with his commanding officer, General Feldmarschall August von Mackensen, who would report the overwhelming victory back to the Kaiser. Though Bruno did not realize it yet, he was about to receive 2 very prestigious awards for his victory had in the opening hours of the Great War, ones that he felt were long overdue considering his long list of accomplishments up until this point. Chapter 204: Human Nature and Its Endless Cruelty. August von Mackensen met up with Bruno not long after the man had emerged victorious against 2 of Serbia's 4 field armies. Granted, their overall size was smaller in comparison to a single German field army, each of which were maxed out at 300,000 men at the start of the war and given the most advanced equipment to fight with. But defeating them both and forcing them to surrender within a handful of hours was no doubt a phenomenal move. Because of this, August von Mackensen gazed at Bruno as if he were the living incarnation of some ancient pagan god of war, before abruptly speaking his thoughts aloud. "I'll have my men relay your victory and its details back to the Kaiser. I think it's about time you were granted a proper rank for a man of your caliber. And if I dare say so, you might be the first one to be awarded an Iron Cross in this war." Bruno also handed a list of names to his current superior officer, of which he guessed would no longer be in charge of him after this swift and brutal victory. The list contained men who he felt had earned some kind of recognition for their performance during the battle. He then walked away as if the prospect of being rewarded for his service didn't interest him in the slightest, but not before leaving behind a few demands as he did so. "Tell the Kaiser unless these men are also properly awarded for their valor, There is no need to waste his time coming to Sarajevo to present me alone with an iron cross." The list was rather extensive, but Bruno had written everything these men had done in battle. He had, after all, been observing the conflict as short as it was, and had interviewed the officers and NCOs beneath his command for any names of the men beneath their command, which they felt had performed admirably during the heat of combat. August von Mackensen took a look at the extensive list and the reasons given for their recommendation, and the award Bruno felt was appropriate for their degree of valor and sacrifice in the face of the enemy. Before looking back to where Bruno had walked off to, he prepared all of this, while also ensuring that the 100,000+ prisoners of war are all being carted off to captivity. What kind of masterful control of his time and resources does this man have? Bruno was recalled to Sarajevo, which was easy enough as he had men in the logistics departments transporting way too many prisoners of war to properly count. He could easily hitch a ride on these trucks before getting on the railway and make it back to the Bosnian capital within a couple of hours. The reason for his recalling was simple enough. The Kaiser had just gotten the excuse he needed to give Bruno with his final promotion, as well as a reward he felt was long overdue for Bruno's many years of service. An award, the Kaiser also felt, would be the first among many which Bruno earned in this war. Of course, the Kaiser needed to travel by train from Berlin to Sarajevo, which would take several days. Because of this, Bruno recuperated after a short but stressful battle on the streets of Sarajevo. He, of course, wanted to check on the small cafe which he had enjoyed during his previous visit to the city. Hoping the young woman took his warning seriously and utilized the exceptional tip he had given her to get her and her family out of the city. Unfortunately, as Bruno gazed upon the smoldering ruins of the family's restaurant and the graffiti which was spread across it, he realized he remembered the cruelty of the world. The words "death to traitors" were written in the Serbian language across the charred remains of what had been a decent cafe. It was clear that by the looks of the weathering across the burned-out ruins, that this had happened quite some time ago. Because of this, Bruno quickly asked bystanders for information on what had happened in his absence. And after a bit more thorough of an investigation than he initially thought was required, probably because of his German uniform, someone revealed that the family had been attacked by Serbian nationalists a year prior, shortly after Bruno left the city. Their property was burned to the ground, and they were murdered in cold blood for the way they treated the soldiers of the imperial powers who frequently visited their establishment. Bruno walked away from that scene of that tragedy, determined to discover who the true culprits were. Luckily for him, both he and his wife had connections to German intelligence, who were but a short call away to request the service of. To say that Heidi was shocked to receive a phone call from Bruno a few days after he had deployed was an understatement, to be sure. But Bruno made it abundantly clear that this was not a matter of pleasantry, but one of business. Heidi instantly got out a pen and paper and wrote down the information Bruno told him, leaving behind some cryptic words as she did so. Although I'm certain this is probably just some random act of violence committed by thugs, I fear there is an improbable but still possible chance that this was something far more sinister. Do you really want me to investigate this matter fully? If it turns out to have been an attack conducted by the Black Hand because of this family's small connection to you, what will you do? Bruno, of course, responded with a stern and callous tone as he reminded Heidi of what she had said to him prior to his deployment away from his home. There must be no hesitation in the way in which you act, nor can there be any mercy shown to our enemies. Do you still remember these words, my love? How could Heidi forget such a thing? They were the words of advice she had given Bruno in preparation for his deployment abroad. Hence why she bit her tongue in anguish, before nodding her head silently as she responded to the man she loved. I do. All right. I will have this matter fully investigated and get back to you before you head back to the front lines. If these innocent people were truly murdered by agitators connected to Serbian intelligence or, God forbid, the Serbian royal family, then do what needs to be done to punish them for their wickedness. Bruno simply left one final and unrelated phrase before hanging up on his wife. The fate of the Serbian royal family and much of its government relied on whether they were complicit in the murder of these civilians. The death of a few civilians was something that happened every day and generally was none of Bruno's concern. But he and Heidi both suspected such a heinous act committed against them, and nobody else could not be mere coincidence. If this family were murdered because they had some loose connection to Bruno, then an example needed to be made, not only to the Black Hand and the Serbian royal family who supported them, but the entirety of the world. After all, if his enemies were willing to engage in such cruelty towards people he had barely encountered in life, then the lengths they would go to in order to harm his loved ones would be much more severe. Such a thing required a deterrence, and such a thing had to be on the scale of nuclear detonation. If not, then those who sought to bring Bruno to ruin would only keep trying and escalating in the level of violence they engaged in towards people associated with him. Bruno could only pray that he and his wife were overthinking things, and that this had just been one of many acts of random ethnic violence committed in the Balkans, which was a regular occurrence throughout the history of the turbulent region. Chapter 205, The Iron Cross Second Class. While Heidi made use of her contacts to search for those responsible for the murder of the Bosnian Serbian family, which had rather graciously served German and Austro-Hungarian troops who occupied the city of Sarajevo a year prior, Bruno himself stood in the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina as a royal procession was made for the troops in the region. Not only did the Kaiser come with his personal guard, but he also brought reinforcements to the front lines. Less than a week had passed since the war began, and yet things were going better than anyone had thought possible. British expeditionary forces had yet to make their way to the European mainland, with every attempt being sunk in the seas before they ever reached the shores of Normandy. Meanwhile, the French army's repeated attempts to assault the German border fortifications, prepared long in advance at Alsace-Lothringen, had met with repeated and gruesome failures. At the start of the war, Bruno had crushed one half of the Royal Serbian Army. Though the Serbians immediately began conscripting and arming every man and boy who could bear arms in preparation for the upcoming siege of Belgrade, Kaiser Wilhelm II had recalled Bruno back into Austro-Hungarian territory to reward him for his crushing victory over the enemy in the opening stages of the war. To put it simply, Bruno was being awarded for his efforts in two distinctive ways. While the German army secured the area where the Kaiser would publicly promote Bruno to the rank of General Feldmarschall, the highest rank in the German army, the Kaiser also intended to pin a distinctive honor on the man's chest. Bruno once more found himself face to face with the German emperor as the man stripped the shoulder boards from his uniform, replacing them with the distinctive crossed batons that a General Feldmarschall would proudly sport. In addition, Wilhelm handed Bruno an Iron Cross Second Class and pinned it in front of his other medals. For this ceremony, Bruno only wore those medals authorized by the German army, such as his China Medal and his Cross of the Iron Division. Everyone else who would be rewarded for their efforts at the Serbian border would receive their honors from their direct commanding officer. Only Bruno, who now answered solely to the Kaiser, would have the medal personally pinned on his chest by Wilhelm. After doing so, the German emperor patted Bruno on the back before saying something to him in an informal and friendly tone. "If it were up to me, I would have given you one of these a long time ago. Unfortunately, we only mint these things for the sake of major conflicts, and the last time an Iron Cross was in production was 1870. I get the feeling that you will have earned all of the grades by the time this war fully comes to an end. So keep up the good work, and there will be more of these to come in the future." Bruno responded silently with a salute, which the Kaiser returned before giving a message to his troops to inspire them. His speech vaguely resembled an oration he had given in his past life. "Arise, to arms. All hesitation, all delay is treason to the country. It is a question of the life or death of our empire, of the life or death of German might. We shall resist to the last breath of man and horse, and shall fight out the struggle even against a world of enemies. When Germany has remained united, she has never been vanquished. Forward with God, for God will be with us as he was with our fathers." The Second German Army was chosen as the reinforcements and mustered to support the German 11th and 8th Armies in their assault on Belgrade, immediately saluted their Kaiser in perfect unison, like a well-oiled machine, before being dismissed by him. Afterward, the Kaiser turned to Bruno and spoke of his vision of Bruno's victory, with words that were also eerily reminiscent of those he had said in the previous timeline. "I get the feeling that this campaign of yours will come to an end before the leaves fall from the trees. Godspeed, my friend, and may the Lord have mercy on your enemies." After saying this, the Kaiser turned away from Bruno not noticing the death glare Bruno was giving him. In his past life, these words resounded in history as a curse. Could the Central Powers have achieved a total victory and ended the war before the year was over? Most certainly, had they achieved victory at the First Battle of the Marne. But fate had other plans in mind, and these words, which the Kaiser had spoken, were often considered a severe lack of understanding regarding the modern battlefield, preluding a meat grinder the likes of which mankind had never witnessed before. Bruno immediately pulled out his case of cigarettes and began to smoke, a sudden and dreadful feeling overwhelming him as he looked off into the distance towards the Serbian border, thinking to himself that he had just been cursed in a way that would bring him great misfortune and misery in the coming days. I suddenly get the feeling that this campaign is about to become a long and brutal affair. It did not take long for Heidi to receive confirmation of her worst fears. The family who owned the restaurant where Bruno had been personally seen dining, and with whom he had casually and cheerfully struck up a conversation, had been murdered in connection with the actions of Serbian intelligence. The Serbian government had decided to rile up ethnic tensions in the region to destabilize Bosnia and Herzegovina following Bulgaria's defeat in the Second Balkan War. After it was discovered that Bruno had given an excessive tip to the young waitress, local nationalist militias assumed she had been sleeping with him as his mistress. Sleeping with a general representing a foreign and occupying power? In what world was that not treason? Because of this, she and her family were brutally murdered, and their place of business was burned down as a reminder of what would happen to others who had done the same or sought to do so. Unfortunately, this was all a misunderstanding, resulting from the Black Hand's deliberate attempts to cause trouble in the region. And when Heidi learned of this, she felt nothing but pain for the victims and for those who would yet suffer. She knew all too well that Bruno's lack of mercy extended to the innocent caught within the blast range of his artillery when aimed at his enemies and wherever they might be hiding. Because of this, there was a part of her that wished not to tell the man what she had come to learn upon investigating the incident. But she also knew she had told him not to show any mercy to their enemies, and this heinous crime was a provocation toward Bruno. Whether intentional or simply the result of the chaos the Serbians had sown in the region, Heidi couldn't find out, but she knew the results would be the same, regardless. Thus, there was a heavy tone in her voice when she finally spoke to her husband on the phone, conveying her thoughts as she did so. Bruno was silent for a long while, causing further concern within his wife's troubled mind. He spoke up before she could inquire as to whether he was all right, stating a simple phrase before hanging up entirely. "I'll handle it. Get some rest." Heidi suddenly got the feeling that Bruno was about to do something unreasonably destructive and, in doing so, might provoke the Balkans into a stiffer resistance than they otherwise would have fought with had he not decided to make an example of the Serbian royal family and their seat of power. Chapter 206, The Butcher of Belgrade. With Bruno now officially holding the highest rank in the German army, he was given operational command over the Balkan theater. At the same time, August von Mackensen was redeployed to the Western Front to hold the line until Serbia, Montenegro, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire could be knocked out of the war entirely. With the Ottomans choosing to get involved in the conflict, both Austria-Hungary and Russia deployed additional field armies along the Russian border with the Turkish Caliphate, seeking to dismantle them as a power once and for all now that there was no longer a reason to keep them around. In doing so, the three European nations of the imperial powers each split their forces across at least 3 theaters. The Germans held the Western line by themselves, while also sending men into Italy and the Balkans. The Austro-Hungarians divided their army into the Alps, the Balkans, and the Caucasus. As for Russia, they were simply fighting in the Balkans and the Caucasus, but had sent a considerable number of troops to the Balkans to aid their Western allies. It was a race against time to see who would reach Belgrade first, and Bruno wanted to be that man. Despite the extensive infrastructure projects the three empires had invested in as a joint venture, they were all but useless once marching into Serbia. This was where Bruno had the advantage. Even after being pulled back by the Kaiser for his promotion and medal, Bruno was still operating with off-road 3.5-ton trucks as transportation not only for supplies, but also for his infantry and artillery. While the rest of the world was currently relying on horses and carriages for their logistic networks, Bruno's army had a straight shot to Belgrade and reached the Serbian capital far quicker than anyone could have anticipated. Within a fortnight, the German 8th Army, along with the accompanying 11th and 2nd Armies, had surrounded Belgrade entirely. But Bruno did not immediately give the order to lay siege to the city. Instead, he waited until a representative of the Serbian crown reached out to him. After 3 days of waiting in trenches dug outside the city, Bruno finally received the response he wanted. A messenger marched into his siege camp and found Bruno, covered in mud as he helped establish his army's fortifications, as if he were just another enlisted soldier within the rank and file. The man could hardly believe that the figure standing before him, covered in mud and grease, was a general of the highest order. Were it not for the distinctive crossed batons on Bruno's greatcoat shoulderboards and the red and black collar that identified him as a General Feldmarschall, the Serbian general, whose coat was immaculate, would have assumed he was being pranked. After taking several moments to collect himself, the snobbish officer addressed Bruno with an unearned air of arrogance. "Well, it would appear you have reached our capital quicker than we anticipated. Since the king and his family still remain in their palace, we have no choice but to seek terms. What do you offer?" For the last 18 hours, it had rained non-stop in the region. As a result, Bruno's ungloved hands, covered in mud, were shivering as he reached into his pocket and lit a cigarette. His habit of smoking to calm his nerves had increased since the war began, going through an entire pack a day by now. Even though he knew it was bad for his health, he continued to do so. He exhaled a plume of smoke from his lungs before motioning towards the city. The words he spoke were not directed toward the Serbian general, but rather to Eric, who stood by Bruno's side, equally unkempt in appearance. "Tell the men to equip their masks. Who knows if we'll be affected by the gas with the way the winds are blowing. Then tell the artillery corps to load the shells marked mustard gas and to keep firing until the city is completely lifeless." Knowing that Bruno was choosing to disregard an attempt at surrender and instead destroy the capital of Serbia and the Serbian royal family within it, Eric wore a sadistic grin as he saluted his commanding officer before rushing off to relay his orders to the necessary departments. As for the Serbian general and his host, they immediately broke into outrage at Bruno, initially half believing that the man was merely bluffing to extract the best terms of surrender possible. "Have you gone mad? According to the Hague and Geneva Conventions, what you are suggesting is a war crime of the highest magnitude. You will be dragged into court and executed if you actually go through with such a barbaric act. Only a madman would negotiate in such a crass manner." Bruno flicked his cigarette into the Serbian general's face, catching the man entirely off guard. This gave him the time to withdraw his Mauser C96 from its holster, where he immediately pointed it at the head of the Serbian general, speaking the words that would later become infamous in the annals of history, as what truly happened here on this day would take decades to uncover. "Who will drag me to court? There's no crime if you don't get caught, and I don't see any witnesses." After saying this, Bruno pulled the trigger, instantly splattering the Serbian general's brains onto the muddied floor of his siege camp. Bruno then shifted his muzzle toward the general's host, gunning them down before they could properly retaliate, as they had been caught off guard by the thunder of the German guns that began to batter the capital of Serbia. With the death of the Serbian delegation and the convenient disposal of their corpses, it was as Bruno said, there were no witnesses to the fact that the Serbians had tried to surrender to the German army. Thus, Bruno did as he suggested to his troops, reaching into the container strapped across his waist, holstering his sidearm, and pulling out his gas mask, which he quickly donned over his face. He gazed upon the distinctive mustard-colored gas as it spread through every corner of the city, which had stood for thousands of years. Why bother using explosive shells to dismantle such a beautiful piece of history when chemical weapons would achieve the same result and leave the architecture intact? The official story initially reported about this siege of Belgrade was that the Serbians utterly refused to surrender, despite being completely surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned by the German army. Given the Serbians' mass conscription, Bruno was left with two options: risk the injury and death of potentially hundreds of thousands of his men, or simply gas the city into submission. Nobody except Bruno and Eric knew the Serbians had tried to surrender, and as a result, While Bruno was condemned internationally for taking such excessive and brutal actions, he would not be taken into international court for war crimes. Instead, he would gain the newest of his many nicknames, and perhaps the most terrifying, the Butcher of Belgrade. A fitting name, given that he had obliterated every soul within the boundaries of the Serbian capital. Of course, the result was that what remained of the Serbian and Montenegrin armies would fight with everything they had to resist the imperial powers and their occupation of the now leaderless kingdom, turning the Balkan campaign into an affair that would last several months longer than it otherwise might have. Chapter 207: Unexpected Consequences of Excessive Retaliation. Rumors of what happened at Belgrade spread like wildfire across the Western world. Belgrade was gassed into extinction by an exceptionally large use of chemical weapons, fired via artillery shells onto the city by the besieging German army. Was surrender not requested? If so, was this a war crime? Why would a man take such overwhelming action against a city that, while having a large military presence, held a far greater number of civilians? What could possibly compel a man to act in such a way? It was shortly after this that German intelligence began leaking information to the public about the Black Hand, their ties to the Serbian government, and the list of crimes they were responsible for, either directly or indirectly. Whether it was the murder of the previous and rightful ruling dynasty of Serbia, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, or the repeated attempts made to murder Bruno because he suggested he was aware of their existence. Everything came to light in the days following the massacre of Belgrade. And because Bruno was the only one who really witnessed what actually happened, he utilized his control over various media outlets across both the German Reich and the USA to depict the Serbian royal family as holding the city hostage and refusing to surrender under any conditions. In addition to this, the Black Hand's arming and training of violent extremist groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which led to a variety of heinous crimes, including the murder of the Bosnian Serbian family, who once served Bruno hot meals at their place of business, led many to conclude that Bruno had decided to make an example of the usurper king and his city. The common headlines in the weeks that followed lambasted the Serbian government for their role in causing the outbreak of this war, blaming the destruction of their capital entirely on them, and the conspirators they protected and sheltered from justice. And while this caused the allies of Serbia to gaze upon the leaderless yet defiant nation with a bit of disdain, choosing to drag them into a war rather than face the consequences of their own actions by themselves, it did not stop the war. Too many factions wanted this conflict to happen, and just because the fault of the Serbian royal family and their ties to the Black Hand were revealed to the public did not mean that hostilities would suddenly cease. No, the war needed to happen, and the death of the Austrian Archduke was simply the excuse needed to finally wage it. Bruno, however, came to severely regret his actions at Belgrade not because they were ineffective in achieving his initial goals. In fact, the example he made of the Serbian capital proved exceptional in this regard, with those who lurked in the shadows and schemed against him suddenly becoming utterly terrified at the prospect of attacking him or people close to him directly. Rather, Bruno regretted his actions because of the unintended consequences they created. Serbia was ready and willing to surrender at Belgrade, potentially ending the war in the Balkans just weeks after it began. Now, however, they refused to admit fault, even with the headlines blaming them for everything that was happening. With the annihilation of their capital and all of the people in it, what remained of the Serbian army and the nation's leadership rallied together far behind the front lines and professed the will to fight until the very end. Not only had the Serbian army begun conscripting every single man capable of fighting against the invasion of their homeland and equipping them with any firearms they could get their hands on, but they had also openly called upon those either too old or too young to join the army to resist in any way they could. With its illegitimate monarchy gassed into extinction in Bruno's siege of Belgrade, the governance of what remained of Serbia fell to the highest-ranking general, who immediately seized control over the kingdom and declared himself the temporary leader of the nation, with unlimited power for the duration of the war. In his public speech, he condemned Bruno as the most heinous of war criminals and a man who Serbia would repel from their borders, even if it took 1,000 years and the blood of future generations to complete. The sudden urge to resist any form of encroachment on their borders by foreign powers rallied those within Serbia, even without any nationalist sentiment, to take up arms. The only problem was, Serbia was not necessarily capable of producing the arms necessary to supply them, and many were given very old and obsolete weapons from national stockpiles to fight with. Even so, Bruno had unintentionally caused the Serbian army to grow from a mere 450,000 strong to well over 1 million, which was roughly 1/4 of its total population and about half of the male population. And while defeating such a large-scale army with the roughly 2 million men he had at his disposal for the theater was easily accomplished, the losses sustained would take generations to overcome. But ultimately, that was not Bruno's concern. Not only that, but another problem now faced Bruno. The other nations of the Balkans were outraged by the massacre at Belgrade, and it was entirely possible that several of the smaller, currently neutral powers would join together with the Serbians to add to their forces. Especially since King Karolai of Romania was about to die, and his successor had already established ties to the Allied powers. Romania's entry into the war alone could boost the numbers of opposition forces in the Balkans to 1.5 million or more. If either Bulgaria or Greece joined the other Balkan states as members of the Allied powers, this would easily put their numbers on par with the combined forces of the imperial powers within the region. Not to mention, it would open lines that would need to be defended by the Austro-Hungarian and Russian armies. Frankly speaking, Bruno wanted the Bulgarians on his side not only because they were a valuable and loyal ally, having sided with the Germans in both world wars, even after their defeat in 1918, but also because, out of all of Germany's allies in both world wars, the Bulgarian army, while a minor power, was the most competent. If Bulgaria were a great power with an army to match its size, then without a doubt Germany would have won either conflict in Bruno's past life. Because of this, Bruno hoped they would join the imperial powers in this life rather than the Allies, especially because they had just fought and lost a war with the other Balkan states a year prior over disputed territories. With all this in mind, Bruno simply had one option to prevent such an outcome: advance beyond the raid of his allies and supply lines and crush the Serbian army and the current provisional government before they could fully muster their strength. This, of course, was a fool's errand that he knew had the potential to destroy his army and cost him the lives of all his men and himself in the process. One must never advance beyond their logistical network in pursuit of a quick victory. Every time this had occurred throughout history, the opposite occurred, usually resulting in the loss of not only the army itself but the war altogether. Because of this, Bruno could only task his army with clearing out the gas that festered in the ruins of Belgrade and fortifying their trenches as they awaited their Russian and Austro-Hungarian allies to catch up. It was better to hold the Serbian capital and wait for the remainder of their allies and logistical networks to reach them before advancing than to embark on a fool's quest. Thus, after annihilating all life in the Serbian capital, the forces of the German army that had wrought such devastation were tasked with cleaning up their mess. Chapter 208: Germania Rules the Waves. The British Royal Navy was having a hell of a time with the onset of the war. Not only had the Empire of Japan attacked their colonies in the east almost immediately after declaring their entry into the conflict, forcing the British to divert their maritime forces to deal with this new threat. Nearly a month had passed since the Great War began, and Britain had already lost over a dozen transport ships in their attempts to cross the North Sea. Any attempt to ferry troops across the English Channel was met with critical failure. Attacks occurred time and time again without warning, resulting in devastating losses as the British scratched their heads, trying to figure out just what the hell was sinking them. Their confusion was understandable. Submarines of the era were essentially torpedo boats that could briefly submerge to escape pursuit. However, they were still visible on the surface of the waves when they conducted attacks. But Germany had produced a far more advanced U-boat, and in significant numbers in preparation for this war. These U-boats operated in wolf packs, which were small units of up to 20 submarines each. These wolf packs hounded British shipping and transportation, destroying them before they could reach the shores of France. In doing so, Germany had silently cut off any and all material supplies and troops meant to reinforce the French army's repeated failed attempts to break through German border fortifications. As a result, The Royal Navy had no choice but to begin protecting their lone transport ships with armed escorts. After all, convoys had yet to fully develop as a logistics tactic, though it wouldn't really matter in the long run. There was just one serious problem with this. The British sailors still couldn't detect the German submarines beneath the surface. Even so, with the mustering of the Grand Fleet, the Germans responded in kind with their high seas fleet, leading to the first major naval engagement of the war. Admiral Franz von Hipper stood on the bow of the pride and joy of the Kaiserliche Marine, the SMS Koenig, the first of a class of dreadnought-style battleships of the same name. The high seas fleet was behind him as he gazed upon the British Grand Fleet in the distance. The Grand Fleet was exceptionally larger than its German counterpart, boasting a total of 28 dreadnought battleships, 9 battlecruisers, 8 armored cruisers, 26 light cruisers, 78 destroyers, 1 mine layer, and 1 seaplane carrier. Meanwhile, the German fleet consisted of 16 dreadnought battleships, 5 battlecruisers, 6 pre-dreadnought battleships, 11 light cruisers, 22 destroyers, 61 U-boats, and 1 seaplane carrier. The addition of the German destroyers, which were far more advanced than their British counterparts and capable of providing multiple roles such as anti-aircraft screening and mine-laying, was due to Bruno's interference in the timeline. As was the seaplane carrier, which held over a dozen He-51 B-2 seaplanes. Each carried torpedoes and was capable of launching them towards hostile ships, effectively making them the world's first dedicated torpedo bombers. All of these changes were not expected by the British Navy, and thus Franz von Hipper was rather smug, even while gazing upon an enemy force roughly twice the size of his own. It was no surprise that there was a confident tone in his voice when he initiated the attack on the British Grand Fleet. "Let's send these bastards down to the depths where they belong, shall we?" Admiral John Jellicoe stood aboard the pride and joy of the British Royal Navy, the largest and most boastful of the Grand Fleet's 26 dreadnought battleships. He was, needless to say, quite surprised when he saw the Germans, despite their numerical inferiority of warships, willing to exchange blows with them in an outright battle. Normally, one would make use of some other form of tactics rather than just going straight for the naval equivalent of a slugfest, and thus the admiral simply scoffed and shook his head before insulting the intelligence of his enemy. They may have built the second most powerful navy in the world, but with such fools leading them, these men might as well commit suicide, because they're already as good as dead. Load the guns and prepare to. A series of hits landed on the bow of multiple British dreadnoughts, including the one Admiral John Jellicoe was standing on, completely interrupting his thoughts as he was speaking them. The man even fell to the floor in the quake that rocked his world. It took him a moment or two to realize that their ship had received multiple hits, and they were not alone. Reports flooded in about substantial damage being dealt by the guns of the enemy's ships, which fired upon their vessels with a substantially higher hit accuracy. The British admiral was stunned and thought perhaps this was a mere coincidence, an act of God, if you will. That is, until the second volley of shots was fired by the German vessels, many of which were operating advanced maneuvers while firing. They were, after all, using advanced electromechanical computation devices with gyro stabilization, allowing them to maintain a fairly high level of accuracy even while the ship was turning. This completely and utterly shocked the British admiral, who managed to get a single statement out before the shell he was gazing upon detonated right on the bridge where he was standing. My God! The German Navy had gone out of its way to focus their guns on the largest and most powerful British warships first. Not only did they attack with their large guns, but the seaplanes, which flew through the sky with impunity after effortlessly shooting down the British aircraft, managed to drop their torpedoes within range of their targets. Britain, after all, had yet to invest in anti-aircraft weaponry on their warships, as the very idea of using planes as anything other than reconnaissance had completely slipped the minds of the other great powers of the world. But not the Germans. No, they were fully utilizing air power and its many versatile roles in battle from the start of the war, thanks to Bruno's interference in the timeline. Because of this, it didn't take more than an hour for the Royal Navy's Grand Fleet to sustain heavy losses, with over half of their dreadnoughts, battlecruisers, and armored cruisers sunk to the bottom of the English Channel. The Germans did not pursue, choosing not to take such a risky venture, and instead basking in their damn near-flawless victory. While the Grand Fleet lost over half of its warships, the Germans sustained substantial damage on one dreadnought, which could be towed back to port and repaired. They also lost 2 pre-dreadnought battleships, as well as 3 cruisers. Comparatively speaking, their losses were almost non-existent and limited to primarily obsolete ships. Anyway, regardless, the German Navy would celebrate this victory, and the admirals in charge of the German High Seas Fleet would sing praises of the weapons produced by Bruno's factories, which had won an otherwise unwinnable battle with ease. Chapter 209: Drastic Measures Against Sudden German Advancements. The German Navy had slapped the pride of the British Empire in the face so hard it felt like there was no choice but to double and triple down on their efforts to cross the English Channel and send troops to aid their allies. Currently, the war was not going in the Allies' favor. The French had repeatedly tried to attack German border fortifications across the Rhine, and were now theorizing about marching through Belgium to try to bypass them altogether, not remotely aware that the Germans had already planned for this potential scheme. Meanwhile, Italy and Austro-Hungary were going back and forth in the Alps, exchanging blows in small skirmishes here and there meant to test each other's strength before either fully committed to a full-scale assault. As for the Balkan campaign, it had turned into a complete and total shit show in the first month of the war. Belgrade was a ghost town, forever haunted by the 100,000 citizens who were buried in a mass grave outside its boundaries. While the Serbian provisional government rallied as many men as they could to send at the nearly 2 million invaders who had massacred their capital and everyone in it, Bruno had dug in at Belgrade, choosing to wait for his allies to catch up with them so they could make a joint push into what remained of Serbian territory and wipe out their newly reformed army in a series of swift and brutal assaults. As for the Ottoman Empire, they were busy combating the Austro-Hungarian and Russian armies in the Caucasus, while at the same time trying to send as many troops to aid Serbia by funneling them through Montenegro. The Ottomans in particular were struck hard, with 500,000 Russians and Austro-Hungarians already marching through the Caucasus, against their 150,000 active soldiers that remained after the Balkan Wars. To put it simply, they were mobilizing as many men as they could as quickly as they could to fight against this sudden threat. Due to Bruno's influence, the imperial powers were the most ready for the war when it began, with each of the 3 European empires having 1 million men to mobilize at its start, all of which were equipped with their most advanced weapons available for deployment. Within a fortnight of the conflict breaking out, another 5 million men between the 3 nations had been fully mobilized for the war effort. Considering the massive industrial investments Bruno had made across their 3 empires, it was no understatement to assert that they could effectively transport these 5 million men and their equipment from the Caucasus to the Rhineland in record speeds. All the while, supplies were constantly being transported between the 3 empires and to their front lines, whether it was oil from Russia or German Cameron. The preparations made a decade in advance saw them make it to the forces who needed it. Of course, none of this really mattered to the British Empire, who were so thoroughly outraged by their loss in the North Sea that they felt the need to avenge it as soon as possible. Reports made it clear that German aircraft carrying torpedoes had played a large role in their shocking victory. Few realized how many torpedoes had been launched by subs beneath the sea, and those in charge dismissed reports about the overwhelming advantage German warships had in terms of accuracy. Because of this, it was assumed that Germany's effective use of aerial assets won the battle in their favor. I mean, until now, the presumed use of aircraft in warfare had been for reconnaissance, and maybe using them to drop grenades on an enemy position. But dedicated bombers, ground attack craft, fighter planes, and torpedo aircraft? The Germans had certainly managed to innovate well beyond anyone's wildest dreams. And creating such a variety of advanced aircraft was simply beyond their means to rapidly develop a counter to, as the use of aircraft in warfare was a relatively new phenomena, one which only the Germans truly understood the significance of. And that was only because they had a man from the future to educate them on the matter. Because of this, the British Royal Arsenals were scrambling for some kind of anti-aircraft weaponry of which none existed outside of the borders of the German Reich, or at least currently. Currently, the British War Department, or at least its leadership, was throwing a tizzy fit over how they would immediately counter this monumental threat to their naval supremacy on the world stage, completely lacking in the critical thinking to comprehend that they had already lost such a thing at the Battle of the North Sea, which just occurred 3 days prior. Instead, these old men whose understanding of warfare was woefully obsolete argued over the most efficient use of their resources. By the time we managed to develop and produce such weaponry to deter German seaplanes, they would have already won the war. It will take a year at the very least to even implement such designs. We have no real basis for how to actively combat aircraft. What are we supposed to do? Strap a pom-pom onto some kind of crude anti-aircraft mount and hope for the best? Though this statement was made ad absurdum, this was more or less exactly what the British had done in Bruno's past life as a means of rudimentary anti-aircraft weaponry. The QF 1-pounder pom-pom was the world's first autocannon, created in the 1880s initially for the purpose of combating infantry. It was essentially a Maxim water-cooled machine gun that had been scaled up to accept a 37mm high-explosive cartridge. During the early days of the Great War in Bruno's past life, it was used as an emergency measure to combat aircraft, and it did the job well enough considering what it was designed to shoot at the time. But by the end of the war, it had begun to show its age, and as a result, nations began to scale it up to even larger cartridges. These improved designs had taken them 3 years to produce and employ into service. Not to mention they had proven woefully obsolete by the outbreak of the Second World War. As it stood, there was no way of knowing if these decades-old autocannons were remotely capable of combating the advanced German seaplanes. However, German torpedo bombers were already an active threat to British naval supremacy. Waiting 3 years for such a solution to manifest itself into existence was simply not an option. And even though the British bureaucrat suggested this, his peers looked at him as if he had actually come up with a practical solution. One of them voiced this very sentiment, much to the lament of the man who had initially voiced it as a jest. Actually, that's not a bad idea. Unless we can come up with a better option, that might just work. After a long and thorough debate on the subject, the British Empire immediately planned the approval of development for an anti-aircraft variant of the QF 1-pounder pom-pom, as well as research and development into other forms of AA weaponry to combat this new and very real threat. Chapter 210, Denser Than a Neutron Star. Heidi's preparations over the last few years, using the money her husband had given her, had not gone to waste. With Heinrich's exceptional organization and management skills being put to efficient use, a series of charitable institutions were founded and operated by Heidi and those under her employment. Whether it was a network of orphanages built across the German Reich and the Russian Empire, or a large investment in doctors, nurses, and other humanitarian efforts, by the time the war began, these critical and often overlooked non-profit organizations were not only in full effect, but were reaching optimal levels of performance. Heidi herself would take 1 day off every week from managing her own household affairs to visit the orphanages established in Berlin, speaking to the children and seeking to aid them in any way she could. She also did her best to find reputable families of proper moral virtue to adopt them. Considering Alia herself was a war orphan, the young woman had decided to dedicate her early adult years to working in the largest of Heidi's orphanages. She would, after all, reach the age of majority within the German Reich later this year. For the time being, as was always the case whenever Heinrich was deployed alongside Bruno, Alia had come to live with Heidi and her children. Bruno's oldest children were now well into their adolescence, with Eva turning 13 this year and Erwin turning 12. Perhaps because of this, Bruno's eldest son and presumed heir had started acting a little strangely around the Russian woman he had grown up with and had long thought of as an older sister. Alia had grown into an exceptionally beautiful woman over the years, and Erwin had naturally begun to notice this as he entered the stage of development where girls became an interest of his. In the past, he would run around and play with his older sister, but now he was incredibly timid and embarrassed whenever she spoke to him. Today was no different, as Heidi enlisted the help of her soon-to-be teenage son to do some heavy lifting around the orphanage. Erwin was in the midst of carrying some heavy boxes full of necessary supplies into the orphanage. He did not complain in the slightest, The boy had been properly raised by his father and mother to be a man of good moral character. The idea of complaining while helping those less fortunate than himself had never crossed his mind. Despite the weight of the boxes, Erwin carried them with a smile, as if he were fulfilling some masculine obligation to do the labor on behalf of the otherwise fragile ladies around him. Once Erwin had stacked the boxes in an orderly fashion and began to distribute their contents to the proper areas, Alya stopped by and made a comment with a smirk on her pretty face and a condescending tone in her elegant voice. "Well, would you look at that? My little brother is growing up so fast. If I didn't know any better, I'd say you were becoming a man after my own heart." Erwin's naturally snow-white skin flushed as his cheeks became rosy in embarrassment over Alya's words. Alya wasn't oblivious. She was well aware of the boy's growing affections for her. She immediately walked over and flicked him on the forehead, trying to dismantle any notions he might have that he otherwise shouldn't. "Listen here, you brat. You are 9 years too young to have such thoughts toward me. By the time you're of proper age, I'll be an old maid. Besides, like it or not, you're a prince, and I'm a commoner. Your parents would be wise to find you a woman close in years and of proper noble heritage for you to marry. And you, little man, would do well to forget about me." Erwin was about to protest and mention that, by law, his mother had been a commoner at birth, as she was a bastard. Yet his father had still married her, and they loved each other more than anything despite this. But Heidi, who happened to be nearby eavesdropping on the conversation, interrupted the heated discussion between her son and the girl she had helped raise over the years before Erwin could get a word in to defend himself. "Alya, I need you in the kitchen. Do you mind joining me for a bit?" Heidi's voice had a way of carrying through even the thickest stone walls, especially when she was giving orders to one of her children. The moment Alya heard the woman's sharp tone, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up, as did Erwin's. Both of them instantly grew silent and embarrassed as Alya walked off, leaving the matter with what she had said, while Erwin felt slightly dejected over his inability to stand up for himself. Alya found Heidi standing in the orphanage's kitchen, dressed in rather common attire and wearing an apron. She was scrubbing down and scouring every surface she could find in a way that was wholly unsuited to her current noble status. This was one of the things Alya admired most about her godmother. She was a woman who placed little significance on her lofty title and her husband's vast fortune, and was more than willing to get her hands dirty when needed, something no other noble lady on the planet would even consider. Alya quickly saw why Heidi had called her for help. The kitchen was abominably filthy. Even with Heidi's exceptional cleaning skills, it simply wasn't a one-woman job. Alya promptly joined in the cleaning. Silence persisted between the two women for a while, until Heidi finally brought up the awkward subject as if it were the most casual topic in the world. "So, has your father found a suitable man for you to marry yet? Surely you have many suitors trying to court you, do you not?" Alya's face turned redder than Erwin's had moments before. She lowered her gaze, almost as if too ashamed to meet Heidi's eyes. It didn't take long for Heidi to understand what was on the young woman's mind, and she immediately blurted out her thoughts. "The unbelievably dense bastard. Is his skull made of lead? He hasn't given a single thought to it, has he? How could he not? He does realize you'll soon reach the age of majority, right? By all rights, you should already be properly engaged, if not setting a date for the wedding by now. What reason could he possibly have for not doing so?" Alya looked like she wanted to die of embarrassment, but Heidi had a way of getting the girl to speak, even when she didn't want to. "What? Have you suddenly gone mute? Speak, woman. You're not a child anymore. You have to take these matters seriously. You don't want to end up old and alone with no family to call your own except for a clouder of cats, do you?" Alya finally sighed, heaving heavily before answering Heidi's question, knowing the woman wouldn't let such an important matter rest. "Papa, he still thinks I'm that little girl he saved from Russia all those years ago. Even though I'll be an adult in the eyes of the law this year, he still hasn't made any real move to see me wed." Heidi looked at the young Russian beauty with a flash of contempt in her fierce blue eyes, not for Alya, but for her foolish bastard of an adopted father. It took her all of 2 seconds to come to a conclusion, making a decision without consulting Alya, Heinrich, or Bruno beforehand. "Well, that settles it then. In a few years, when Erwin reaches the legal age to marry, he'll take you as his bride. I see no other option at this point." Alia's jaw dropped. She began to stutter, trying to form a protest, but ultimately fell silent as she failed to produce coherent words. Eventually, her face turned an exceptionally bashful shade as she turned away, hiding her face from Heidi, who looked at her with a sympathetic smile. Chapter 211. Gaslighting is an art form. Heinrich sneezed as he was in the middle of finishing up construction efforts on the fortifications established outside the now vacant city of Belgrade. He had a hard time with what had been done to the Serbian capital, specifically all the residents inside of it who had passed away. Under the orders of his commanding officer, over 1 million innocent lives were terminated in the blink of an eye, and in the most horrific way imaginable. Mustard gas was particularly nasty. There were plenty of better ways to go, that was for sure. Other chemical weapons of the era would suffocate you to death, but mustard gas was a blister agent, causing intense burns to the inside and outside of one's body until they were no longer recognizable as human. Purging the gas which sank into the depths of the city had been a task of itself. Then came removing and disposing of 1 million bodies. I mean, how did one even go about that? Cremation was impossible. The amount of fuel needed to turn 1 million corpses into ash was unimaginable. It would completely derail the war effort. Even then, creating a single body took hours of time, even with the most modern methods from the 21st century. It would take decades to dispose of such a monumental volume of bodies in that manner. This meant that the only real option was to dig a mass grave and carefully dispose of the bodies which had been exposed to chemical weapons. It was a long and arduous process, one that damn near broke Heinrich's psyche as he disposed of men, women, and children by tossing their unrecognizable remains into a giant, unmarked grave. Not even pets were spared from the brutality of this war, and it had only just begun. Because of this, he stared off into space, smoking a cigarette with a completely defeated expression on his face. It was at that moment that Bruno sat down next to the man and handed him a message, one that thoroughly snapped him out of his daze. "What's this?" Bruno stole Heinrich's cigarette straight from his hand when the man wasn't paying attention and took a long drag from it before tossing it aside, stomping out from under his feet as he walked away with only a brief statement in response. Letters from the home front. Heinrich quickly tore open the letter, which bore the mark of Bruno's house, and saw what was written inside, cursing under his breath as he ran off to Bruno and yelled at him from behind. "You fucking bastard. Did you know?" Bruno turned around and looked at the man with a stern expression on his face, before giving the man a grim warning as he did so. "I'd be careful with that tone of yours, my old friend. Look around you and see what happened to the last people who provoked my fury. Now I'm going to let you rephrase your words, which I'm assuming were spoken in haste and without much thought." The air around Belgrade was stale, and fog persisted through the hollowed city streets, making it seem like the city capital was haunted by the souls of the citizens who once lived there. Heinrich calmed himself with a deep breath before asking the question he really meant to say, but was too emotional to properly express. "Do you know what your wife has done?" Bruno looked at his friend as if he were an idiot, before pointing out a subtle fact about the letter that was in his hands. "How could I possibly know what that letter entails? It was sealed when you got your hands on it, was it not?" Heinrich quickly looked down at the letter in his hands, realizing how stupid he sounded right now. "I'm sorry. That was rude of me, and quite foolish. You know that I'm just having a hard time with what we did here is all. I think I need some air." Bruno walked over and pat his friend on the back, assuring him that all was forgiven as he did. "So, no worries. I know what I ordered the men to do doesn't sit right with you. But you know why I did it, right? You know what they did. I mean, it has been all over the papers lately. Rumors of this so-called Black Hand and their various misdeeds. The truth is, they are very real, and I stumbled upon them purely by chance during my first visit to Serbia. Since then, they have tried to claim my head on multiple occasions. I let it go, as they utterly failed to harm me time and again. That is until they decided to strike at people who I was barely acquainted with, solely because they knew me in passing. I can't protect everyone I meet after all. But if the Black Hand is willing to harm innocent people who have no real connection to me other than a chance encounter, then I can't help but think who might try the same thing in the future. A message had to be made to my enemies, hiding throughout the shadows of the world. Such cowardice has consequences, and Belgrade will forever remind them of this fact. I won't lie to you. What we did here was evil, But unfortunately, it was a necessary evil. After all, think what would happen if these shits tried to assault your daughter on her way home from the orphanage she works at, or God forbid, began picking off the kids you looked after a decade ago in Russia because they were loosely associated with me. Fear was an excellent motivator. Was there a chance such a tragedy could come to pass? Certainly. Was it probable? Not in the slightest. There was a much longer list of targets other than Alya and some Russian orphans who were now adults that Heinrich had looked after during the Russian Civil War a decade prior. But the mere suggestion of such a possibility was all Bruno needed to convince Heinrich that sometimes evil deeds were needed to deter greater evil from happening to the ones you loved. Thus Heinrich sighed, and was able to solve the moral dilemma he was having, despite the fact that he was subtly intimidated into doing so. I suppose you're right. God, I can't even think about such a thing happening to Alya. A city alone would not sate my bloodlust if such a thing came to pass. And besides, the stubborn bastards didn't even try to surrender despite being surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned by a superior foe. It's ultimately the fault of the Black Hand and the usurper who conspired with them that such a tragedy has occurred. Heinrich was obviously not with Bruno when he met with the Serbian delegation. Had he been there, he would have stood in Bruno's way. Perhaps then Bruno may have been convinced not to destroy an entire city just to make a point to the world that he and those connected to him were off limits from guile, subterfuge, and plots of intrigue. Because of this, he did not know that the Serbians had actually tried to surrender, and that Bruno had killed them and buried the evidence in order to avoid facing war crimes for his heinous actions. Instead, before such a topic could continue into scrutiny, Bruno shifted the conversation to what had so thoroughly outraged Heinrich to begin with. By the way, what was in that letter of yours that had you so outraged to begin with? For a second, Heinrich had completely forgotten about why he was so angry at Bruno, and quickly sighed and shook his head, admitting now that he realized Bruno could not possibly have known what his wife had done behind both their backs. It's not that important of a matter. I will just have to have a conversation with your wife once we are done with this dreadful war is all. Bruno smiled and nodded his head, patting his friend on the shoulder once more before walking off, leaving the matter settled with those words. That is until Bruno stopped in his tracks and turned around, where he reached into his own pocket and pulled out an identical letter with its own seal already removed. The most shameless smirk the man had ever managed to express was written across his face as he admitted that he indeed knew what was inside and was simply gaslighting his friend. By the way, my wife wrote to you about how neglectful you have been as a father. The fact that your daughter is about to come of age and is still yet to even have a single discussion about a potential engagement to a proper man? Simply disgraceful. Naturally, my wife sought my opinion on the matter long before she broached it with your daughter. Of course, I gave her my approval well in advance. Welcome to the family, my friend. Bruno walked off with a rather chipper step in his footing, having clearly provoked his friend well enough that he had forgotten all about the massive cost of life that had occurred in this city just days before. Meanwhile, Heinrich cursed at Bruno and threw a small rock at his back, which missed the target by a mile. At the same time, he screamed obscenities at his best friend for screwing with him in such a way. You fucking prick. Chapter 212. Welcome to Isanzo. If there was one man throughout human history you wanted in charge of holding the line, it was none other than Svetozar Borojevic. The man's abilities in defensive warfare were quite legendary among those historians who knew his name, at least among those from the 21st century of Bruno's past life. And there was a reason for this. Currently, he was tasked with holding the line in the Alps, and that's exactly what he did. While Bruno had massacred Belgrade and dug in waiting for reinforcements to arrive and for the enemy to attack in force, Svetozar was high up in the Alpine mountains, standing within his own fortifications as he gazed upon the Italian army below, who was desperately trying for the third time this month to break through the defenses he had previously established in the region. Among Bruno's inner circle, there were only 2 foreigners, and Svetozar was one of them. He had known well in advance that the war was going to break out, and because of this used his time, contacts, and resources to help prepare for it. Having been promoted to Feldmarschallleutnant in 1908, a rank exclusive to the Austro-Hungarian armed forces, Svetozar used his influence to place himself in a position of command within the Alpine region. In doing so, he spent the last few years building proper fortifications in the area, to eventually hold the line long enough for Bruno to take the Balkans out of commission. Once that would happen, Bruno would march his army group into the Alps and crush the Italians together with his ally and confidant. Or so was the plan, and because of this Svetozer was holding the line, even now. An artillery shell hid in the distance, yet near enough that shrapnel pinged off of Svetozer's Stahlhelm. The man didn't even flinch, as by now he was so accustomed to such explosive weaponry that he quite literally remained motionless as he continued to smoke his cigarette with a stoic expression on his face. As per usual, artillery barges would precede an assault. Once the guns stopped firing and the whistles started blowing, the Italians would be running up the hills straight into rifle and machine gun fire. It was only a matter of time. Thus, all the Austro-Hungarian and German forces could do was wait. In the meantime, General Feldmarschall August von Mackensen, who while technically in control of the Isonzo theater at this point, had largely delegated authority over the defenses to his Austro-Hungarian ally, walked over and spoke to the infamous Croatian general with a letter in his hand. The letter was addressed not to the German field marshal, despite the nature of its origin, but instead to the Austro-Hungarian general, who only moved a muscle once he noticed the elderly man approaching him. I have received word from Belgrade. The Serbian army has arrived, and along with them are 200,000 Turks. Bruno states he will hold his ground until reinforcements arrive, and that we should do the same. Although I have no idea why he addressed you rather than me with this letter, is he aware that I am relying on your expertise? Did you inform him of this without my knowledge? Svetozer finally spoke, and when he did, it was almost as if a statue had come to life. He flicked his cigarette away, over the edge of the trench, and by extension the cliffside it was built into before snatching the letter from August von Mackensen's hands. Briefly reading its contents before handing it back, the man looked completely unfazed as he spoke rather openly about the ties he had to Bruno. It's not exactly a secret that he and I are acquainted. Where do you think my men acquired the MP-05s that are otherwise exclusively sold to the German army? And before you comment, we received permission from your Kaiser to do so after the assassination of the Archduke. It was seen as a necessary war preparation by both of our nation's leadership. If you must know, he told me at the start of this that he would seize control of the Balkans and force the Serbians to capitulate by year's end, after which he would send his forces here so we can take out the Italian army together. He is merely giving me an update on his situation after certain unforeseen circumstances arose out of that hellish region. August von Mackensen looked at Svetozer strangely while asking the question, which perplexed him. Hellish region? Are you referring to the Balkans? Aren't you from Croatia? Svetozer looked at the German field marshal as if he were an idiot before explaining exactly why he had said what he said. Of course, nobody knows how atrocious the Balkans can be more than those of us who live there. Now, do you have any other questions? Because in case you didn't notice, there are whistles ringing in the distance, which gives us about 2 minutes before we have to deal with a horde of screeching Italians. August von Mackensen simply shook his head before unslinging the MP-34 on his shoulder and making sure a round was chambered and that it was ready to fire. After doing so, he held it by his side, thinking about how great of an advantage such a weapon was in trench warfare. Svetozer returned his gaze to the distance, where he saw a field of grayish-green uniforms were rushing up the hill towards their defenses. He couldn't help scoff at the absurdity of the situation they were all in. Is it just me, or did everyone and their mother decide on the same color of uniform for this war? I swear to God, if it weren't for the fact that the Italians had opted for those shitty French Adrian helmets, I would have a hard time determining who precisely is friend or foe. August von Mackensen gazed through his binoculars upon the hostile force and realized that the Austro-Hungarian general had made a valid point. It wasn't strange for the German army and the Austro-Hungarian army to both adopt Feldgrau as the primary color of their uniforms. The Germans had been among the first to adopt an earthly tone as their standard uniform, and due to the close relations between them and the dual monarchy, it made sense that the Austro-Hungarian army would follow suit. But it was very strange that the Italian uniform not only shared a near-identical color, but also a similar overall design to the German army attire, which was based upon the designs used by the German Reich during the latter years of the Great War from Bruno's past life. Ultimately, They didn't have much time to ponder the absurdity of the situation they were in, as soon enough gunfire was exchanged between the two factions on the front lines, and the two generals were busy communicating orders to the men stationed there. For the third time since the Great War had begun less than a month prior, the Isonzo Theater continued in its intensity. Chapter 213. For Faith, King, and Fatherland. Rain once more poured upon the Balkan landscape, flooding the trenches built outside the Serbian capital of Belgrade, which was now a ghost city. Fog ruled throughout the city and its surroundings, as echoes of artillery and gunfire in the distance crept throughout the haunted ruins of what had once been a thriving metropolis. It was clear that whatever reinforcements were closest to Bruno's position had encountered the Serbian army, or what composed the provisional government's armed forces after Bruno had massacred the overwhelming majority of the Serbian royal army, both in the initial engagement of the war and when he gassed the capital of the once proud Slavic kingdom. The blood-curdling screams in the distance, as well as the strange sounds that occurred when raindrops clanged against steel helmets and artillery pieces, did not help the eerie atmosphere. Many believed they were hearing haunted echoes of the ghosts who had once lived peacefully in the city behind the trenches. Bruno, however, was not a superstitious man, nor did he care much about the squabbling of the men beneath his command. Instead, he peered into the fog, standing in the rain, gazing over the edges of the trench with his naked eyes. A plume of smoke exuded from his mouth as Heinrich approached him, concerned about the sounds of battle in the distance and whether or not they should reinforce their allies, who were clearly fighting a pitched battle in the field not far away. "Sir, are we seriously just going to sit here and wait out the battle? Would this not be a great chance to envelop the enemy from behind and eliminate them?" Bruno, however, remained silent as he listened to the combat ambience, as if there were something in particular he was trying to detect among the many distinctive and chaotic sounds emerging from the armed battle between the two armies. Heinrich was one of the few men who had been granted permission to be informal with Bruno, his superior officer, so long as the two were in private. But there were enlisted soldiers standing near them. They were, after all, gazing into the fog at the front lines for a better chance of piercing its vast miasma of concealment. Because of this, the man had to use somewhat formal language, even if it was still relatively lax by military standards. Bruno did not respond to anything the man had said and continued to sternly gaze into the distance. That was until he finally recognized the sound he was hearing. It admittedly took him longer than it should have to identify the source, as the thought of using such means of combat, even after most of the world's major and minor powers considered it woefully obsolete, was almost unthinkable to Bruno. Perhaps if he had properly understood the haste with which the provisional army was mustered, as well as those who composed its ranks, he would have guessed sooner. Either way, he didn't have much time to prepare. Luckily for him, his soldiers were equipped with highly mobile and rapid-firing weapons, which he instantly conveyed orders to by shouting toward the most needed men in that very moment. "I need a machine gun team on my location ASAP. Cavalry charge inbound. ETA 2 minutes. Cavalry charge? Was Bruno being serious? Either way, nobody dared to disobey the orders of a man who had gained 3 terrifying nicknames over the course of his military career. Because of this, a machine gun team rushed over to where Bruno was standing and rapidly laid down an MG-34, mounting its bipod on top of the sandbag in front of them while they ensured a round was chambered. In addition, every rifleman within the vicinity, as well as the NCOs with their submachine guns, rushed over to the edge of the trench line, preparing for contact with the enemy. Bruno himself prepared for the approaching moment as he unslung his submachine gun off his shoulder and turned off the safety. The man continued to smoke with the cigarette in his mouth while his weapon was shouldered, and his line of sight was gazing down the aperture toward the fog in front of him. Heinrich stood by Bruno's side, as did Eric, who rushed over with his own MG-34, which he likewise mounted in a position that gave him optimal performance. Bruno looked over at the man with an almost envious gaze, dropping the cigarette from his mouth and into the mud beneath his feet as he questioned his friend about the weapon he had mysteriously acquired. "Where in the holy hell did you get that? Last time I checked, you weren't issued a machine gun." Eric smirked at Bruno with a sinister gaze, almost as if he were all too eager to gun down the charging enemy with rapid fire. Never mind you where I got my hands on such a beautiful engine of destruction. If you think for one moment I'm going to give up the opportunity to shoot an MG-05, you have gone insane, sir." Heinrich looked at his two friends and how excited they were for the prospect of combat, and realized he might very well be the only sane member among their infamous trio, going so far as to issue his complaints in the most respectful manner possible. "With all due respect, sir, I think that you and your adjutant here are a little too eager to engage with the enemy." Eric looked over at Heinrich and rolled his eyes, as if his old friend was a buzzkill, while Bruno patted the man on the back and assured him that the reason he was so excited for this upcoming skirmish was not because he was particularly sadistic, but because this might very well be a historical moment they were about to take part in. "Oh, my dear old friend, sometimes I wonder if you are a bit too simple-minded. Why would I not be excited about this moment? After all, this might very well be the last cavalry charge ever recorded in human history, and we are about to play a critical role in it." When Heinrich realized he could neither refute Bruno's words nor truly condemn the man for being a bit too excited to make history, he simply shook his head and sighed as he spoke the only words that were appropriate for him to say in this situation. God fucking damn it. The Provisional Government of Serbia had rushed conscription, training, and deployment of its male population, or at least those capable of bearing arms. Because of this, they rounded up all the old veterans from previous service and sent them off to retake Belgrade. This was a desperate move, one that was ill-conceived. Its intent was simple: deal as many casualties to the German armies entrenched there before the enemy reinforcements could arrive to aid them. Hence the existence of cavalry old horsemen who had been called upon once more to serve their nation in a time of war. They dragged their weary old bones onto the steeds they were given and were sent to charge the enemy defenses. In addition to this, there were infantry and artillery men supporting them, albeit much of their equipment was woefully obsolete by this point. The Serbian arsenal had not exactly produced record numbers of modern equipment in preparation for a global war in which they would sustain heavy losses. Because of this, Serbian logistics were currently a rather jumbled mess of various different weapons and munitions, few of which shared commonality in caliber. It was not exactly an exaggeration to say that a soldier in the Serbian Provisional Army could expect his supply line to end when he ran out of whatever he was carrying on him in that very moment. It was far from an ideal situation for Serbia and the men who were conscripted to fight for its last gasp of breath. But then again, none of them had expected their leadership to drive them all into the depths of hell. Unfortunately, it would appear that God was not on Serbia's side, as before they could reach the fortifications established around Belgrade over the course of the last month since Bruno first gassed the city's population into extinction, the 1st and 2nd Provisional Armies encountered the Austro-Hungarians on their route to the capital or what remained of it. The fighting was intense, but the Austro-Hungarians were ultimately forced to withdraw, as they were heavily outnumbered by the Serbian conscripts, and their military was not exactly on par with the level of training, equipment, and, frankly, communication as those operating under Bruno's command. Losses were more than the Serbians were expecting during the battle, but Belgrade was within their sight, and these old men had a job to do: sacrifice their lives to inflict as many casualties on the German army as they possibly could. And that was ultimately the objective of this suicidal mission they had been given. At the very least, this would buy the Serbian Provisional Government time to prepare the younger generations to fight a proper war. These old men were all too aware of the sacrifice they were making. Even so, they were undeterred as the officer in charge of the cavalry forces blew his whistle and raised his sword as the charge began. For faith, king, and fatherland. Chapter 214, Witnessing the End of an Era. The battle cry of the Serbian Royal Army rang throughout the mists, echoing like thunder and accompanied by the bellows of the hooves of their steeds. There was no mistaking it, the cavalry was charging at them in full force. Because of this, Bruno gave the order to his men to unleash hell upon them, even if they could not fully see the enemy. Open fire. If he hadn't had tinnitus before, Bruno most certainly did now, as did every other soldier standing in the mud and rain as they sprayed lead blindly downrange as quickly as possible. Semi-automatic rifles, combined with the varying rates of fire from the submachine guns wielded by non-commissioned and commissioned officers alike, as well as the relentless machine gun teams, filled the air with a deafening roar. There was always more ammo and spare barrels awaiting them. In addition to this, mortars of varying sizes fired off into the mist randomly and without direct aim, hoping at the very least that the shrapnel alone would deal some damage to potential enemies. Evidently, the reckless and wanton violence that the Germans had chosen to unleash upon the voices within the fog had a real effect. Moments after the shots began to ring out, screams of men and horses alike could be overheard, assuming one was not already deafened by the monumental volume of lead they were sending downrange. Whether by sheer chance or sheer volume, one by one horses emerged from the fog, their riders raising swords and guns alike as they tried desperately to reach the trenches that lay no more than 300 meters in front of them. It was a plan that might have worked, if not for the preparations the Germans had made in advance. If the barbed wire didn't snare the old nags and trap them like flies in a spiderweb, then the far more sinister surprise lying just beneath the surface would do them and their riders in. In fact, the steed of the man leading the charge, or who at least appeared to be, due to the extravagance of his old headwear from a long-forgotten era, was the first to step on a hidden mine. Without even understanding what had happened, the legs of his horse were blown out from under it as a mine bounced into the air and burst before the cavalry officer even knew it was there. The man was thrown from his steed, covered in the blood of the brilliant gelding he had been given for this conflict, as well as some of his own, as, much to his dismay, he found his torso leaking profusely with his bodily fluids. One of the many ball bearings from the detonated mine had struck him, delivering what would be a mortal blow. Assuming he made it out of this place alive, he would need immediate care if he even wanted a chance of survival. But his fate was here and now, as he stared down at the man wearing the greatcoat, cap, and insignia of a German generalfeldmarschall. Bruno was no more than 100 yards away from the old man who had suffered a rather horrific fate due to his preparations. Precisely how the old Serbian cavalry officer had managed to penetrate so deep into no man's land without getting caught in barbed wire or detonating a landmine sooner, only God truly knew. But one thing was certain. The German general staring at him ended his life then and there with a sinister smirk and a squeeze of the trigger. Bang! Bruno had to admit, even he did not know how the Serbian commander had reached so far into his no man's land with impunity. Fortunately, the man was not protected by plot armor and had indeed fallen to the many landmines hidden in the vast territory outside the trenches, which were filled with barbed wire and such horrific devices. In fact, the Serbians never really had a chance. Landmines had been developed by Bruno specifically for this war and were currently only being employed on the borders with France and here outside Belgrade. There were engines of war that could be used to clear these sinister contraptions thoroughly, but that would have to wait until after the battle was over. In the meantime, Bruno shifted his focus from the man he had just killed with a bullet to the head and instead aimed toward one of the other men screaming and pleading as they were stuck in mud and barbed wire. Others were too fearful to move forward or back as they saw their comrades already blown to bits by the explosives hidden beneath the surface of the earth. It was truly a fearsome sight, even if one was aware of the existence of landmines. But this was like the earth itself was exploding beneath their feet for no logical or rational reason, as if God himself had decided to mercilessly toy with them in a way they could neither comprehend nor escape from. Once the Serbian army, or what remained of it after battling the Austro-Hungarians to a Pyrrhic victory, found itself trapped within Bruno's vast net of death, there was nothing they could do but wait for death to claim them. Those who had not yet given up on life tried to return fire against the Germans. But it was a futile task. Many were equipped with old and obsolete weapons, even if they had modern bolt-action rifles issued to the Royal Serbian Army prior to its annihilation at Bruno's hands. How could they effectively counter a well-fortified and entrenched army equipped entirely with semi-automatic and automatic weapons? A few lucky Serbian soldiers managed to hit a small number of German soldiers whose steel-plated skulls were the only thing exposed above the trench line. But to claim that more than 100 German soldiers were injured or died in this engagement, that would be absurd. It was truly a one-sided slaughter that left no dignity to its victims, and that was just how Bruno liked his battles to unfold. Because of this, the suicidal assault of the Serbian Provisional Army on their occupied capital would live on in infamy as the last great cavalry charge in human history, one far more infamous and tragic than the legendary charge of the Light Brigade. As often as Bruno had said it over the last decade, today was the day the world realized it was truly the end of an era, and he was front and center to witness its final glory, or lack thereof. The age of knights and chivalry had gone out with a violent and gruesome death, one that was all too emblematic of what this great war would come to represent, both in this life and the previous one. Chapter 215, Violating Neutrality. It had been well over a month since the outbreak of war before Bruno received his reinforcements at Belgrade, allowing him time to properly organize and prepare for the next step in subduing the Balkans. In the meantime, the French were sustaining heavy casualties in every field of war they fought in, whether it was their attempts to break through Alsace-Lothringen or any of the other areas along the border they shared with Germany. The Germans had prepared a series of fortifications so grand that there was a railway built beneath them, ferrying troops from one section of the border to another, allowing for reinforcements and supplies to rapidly arrive where they were needed at any given moment to repel the French assaults. These trains were armored, and armed to such a capacity that they did not need to fear French reprisal when they ventured beyond the more fortified sections of the border which concealed them from enemy fire. This more or less allowed the German army to send soldiers and resources wherever they were needed, at any given time, and with complete impunity. And this had gotten on the nerves of the French High Command, who had sent well over 200,000 men to their deaths in the course of a single month of warfare, and with not a single inch of ground to show for it. If that were not bad enough, French colonies in Asia had come under attack, specifically those within Indochina. They were aware that the Japanese were a part of the imperial powers, but it had been completely unexpected that the Imperial Japanese Army would launch a full-scale invasion against Allied colonies in the region. In 1912, Emperor Meiji had passed away as a result of uremia. Despite Bruno's hefty investments into the field of medicine, dialysis, which was the only known way to treat such a disease, was still years away from being invented by the time of the legendary Japanese emperor's death. Because of this, his son Yoshihito, who after his eventual passing would become known by the name of Emperor Taisho, had come to power. And in doing so, he had brought the full weight of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy to bear on the Western Allied powers who had colonized much of the Asian continent. As per German, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian agreements with the fourth member of their military alliance, the Japanese were allowed to keep any ground seized in their assault against the colonial possessions of the Allied powers, assuming of course they were capable of maintaining their hold over it. After all, the other three empires within the imperial powers were all centered in Europe, with limited assets in Asia, and those assets were more or less dedicated to the control over their territories in the region. Imperial Japan was on its own in its war against the Allied powers, and that was fine. Even with the forces stationed in Asian holdings, the Allied powers combined could not hold off the invasion of multiple fronts by the Empire of Japan. To say that the French were getting hit hard on all fronts was an understatement. And because of this, Leon was under increasing pressure to obtain some form of victory, if not simply for the sake of gaining public support for the war, which was already starting to wane quite rapidly. Leon had broken out his medical supply kit, where he found a ration of a particular white powdery substance. I'm talking, of course, about cocaine. Yes, it was an interesting era, where cocaine and amphetamines were issued to troops on both sides as stimulants to maintain operational readiness. Or at least, this had been the case in Bruno's past life. But Bruno had come from the future and knew the drawbacks of such drugs, as well as the actual detriments they posed in a field of combat, which often outweighed the benefits. Because of this, the German army had a strict no-drugs policy, with the consumption of opiates, amphetamines, cocaine, and pretty much every substance of the era outside of nicotine being worthy of a court-martial, if it were discovered that one was using it. This included alcohol, which was only permitted outside of an active war zone, and while a soldier was not currently on duty. Even then, they were only permitted to consume a small amount. If they were intoxicated or hungover by the time they were expected to serve, there would be serious ramifications. Better forms of medicine existed within the German Reich for use within field hospitals and field clinics. preventing the use of morphine within the war, which had been a serious blight among wounded servicemen within Bruno's past life. But these strict rules only existed within the German army. Even their allies partook of these substances as if they were completely normal, let alone the Allied powers. Leon was no exception, drawing out the powdery snow-white substance on the table laid out within his tent, before snorting it outright for maximum effect. He could feel a jolt of electricity shoot directly through his brain as he pounded the desk with his fist in excitement. As he quickly hopped up out of his seat in a better mood than he had been in after receiving orders from his commanding officer to initiate a march through Belgium and Luxembourg in order to attack German territory further north. Belgium was neutral in the war, as was Luxembourg, neither of which had declared for any side, nor shared any information. In fact, the Germans had been exceptionally generous with the two nations neighboring their borders, doing everything they could to ensure the two nations did not report the building of fortifications on their borders, while assuring them it was meant to prevent an outright French invasion, and was not a sign of hostility to the two nations. In addition to this, the German Kaiser assured both the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg and the Kingdom of Belgium that if the French were to make any aggressive moves towards them, they simply needed to call upon the German Reich for aid, and the German army would be at their beck and call. Because of this, the German Reich had fostered better relationships with their neighbors than in the previous life Bruno had come from. And Leon was currently facing the consequences of that, as the French, just like the Germans with their Schlieffen plan, had long since plotted to use Belgium and Luxembourg as a staging point. They had just not initially done so, hoping to break through Alsace-Lorraine first. With this goal thoroughly dashed by the extent of the German border fortifications, they found themselves with no choice but to proceed with their alternative plan. Thus, Leon stood up from his seat with an increased and unnatural vigor as he sought out his adjutant and declared the orders that had been given to him by the French Army's high command. "Relay my orders to the men. We are to pack up our equipment and head north. Under the command of my superiors, we are to march through Luxembourg and attack the Germans on their border located there. Any questions?" Leon's adjutant immediately knew that his commanding officer was high off his rocker, as the man's pupils were dilated to an absurd degree, and because of this he was quick to scratch his nose, suffering from a similar addiction problem, before asking Leon the immediate question that came to his mind. Should I inform the men to break out their medical kits and consume the remainder of their marching powder? Marching powder being the slang of the era for cocaine, it was obvious to Leon, who was a frequent abuser of the stimulant, what his subordinate was referring to. And since he was already high as a kite of the substance, he couldn't fathom how less Colombian snow could possibly be a bad thing. Thus he was quick to approve this order. Why the hell not? We're marching to victory, are we not? Better to be in our peak condition, don't you think? Leon didn't realize it, nor did the leadership of the French Republic, but in their desperation for some form of victory against the Germans, one which was reliant on faulty intelligence, they were about to drive the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg into the hands of the German Reich. Luxembourg was a nation with a complicated history, due to the enmity between France and Germany that had existed since the breakup of the Carolingian Empire in 887 AD. They were as much German and French as Alsace-Lothringen and Switzerland were. But unlike Alsace-Lothringen, Luxembourg had maintained its independence as a Grand Duchy. Until now, that is. In Bruno's past life, Luxembourg was occupied by the German Reich as a result of the Great War and was given back their independence following the defeat of the Central Powers in 1918. However, with the changes Bruno had made in this life, it was clear that France had suddenly become the aggressor, and in doing so, they would ensure that Luxembourg called upon the army of the German Reich to aid in their defense. And in doing so forever changing the course of history for the relatively small and minor European nation. Chapter 216, The Lion of Africa Strikes Back. The war in Africa was unfolding just as it had in Bruno's past life. General der Infanterie Paul-Emile von Lettow-Vorbeck, who had earned himself the nickname, the Lion of Africa, in his past life, was proving to be every bit as much a menace to the Allied invasion of German colonial territories within the continent as he had been then. Outmanned by several 100,000 men and outgunned against an enemy largely equipped with modern weapons, von Lettow-Vorbeck and his troops used firearms and artillery primarily issued during the previous century. The German general was regarded as the leader of the single most effective guerrilla campaign in human history, and rightfully so. This absolute madman was leading a force of 2,700 primarily local African colonial conscripts against an enemy invasion of 20,000 British soldiers. These were, of course, just the initial figures. By the end of the Great War in Bruno's past life, General der Infanterie Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck had commanded a maximum force of 18,000 men, holding off 250,000 Allied troops in the East African campaign for 4 full years, and was the last German general to surrender in the war. This was 250,000 men who could have been sent to Europe but were instead tied up in the colonies, where they suffered nearly 10 deaths for every German Schutztrupp killed in action. His success in the war had been a near mythical feat, one that, sadly, remained unknown to the majority of people long after he accomplished it. In this life, Bruno had worked behind the scenes to ensure that the Schutztrupp under the command of the Lion of Africa was equipped with the modern weapons needed to kill 10 times the already astonishing number they had in Bruno's past life. Because of this, the highly mobile guerrilla force was armed with G43 semi-automatic rifles, MP34 submachine guns, MG34 general-purpose machine guns, and man-portable mortars in the 60mm, 81mm, and 120mm varieties. In addition, they were equipped with 7.5cm FK-16NA field guns, which were lighter in weight and could be carried by pack horses. Their uniforms were mostly the same, but instead of the infamous pith helmets, they used 1916 pattern Stahlhelms to protect their skulls from enemy artillery fire. This would, hopefully, reduce casualties. Paul Emil von Lettow-Vorbeck, unlike other commissioned officers and NCOs who favored the rapid-fire MP34 submachine guns, much preferred the semi-automatic G43. This already gave him a substantial increase in rate of fire over his foes, while also providing superior range, accuracy, and control over how he spent his limited munitions. Because of this, he sat on horseback with the rifle slung across his back, gazing through his binoculars at the British expeditionary force sent into German East Africa to deal with him and his men. The British were expecting a full surrender, but instead, General von Lettow-Vorbeck surprised his enemies by withdrawing his troops, weapons, and supplies as they fled deeper inland, forcing their adversary to pursue them. The British had yet to actually see combat, as they had not been capable of landing troops into France. Even now, despite their redoubled efforts to do so, they were eager for a victory and had quickly fallen into the trap which the Lion of Africa had laid for them. His men were hiding behind a berm, with their rifles and machine guns laid bare in the prone position, while mortars and artillery hiding in the bush were already loaded and aimed at the advancing British forces. Upon seeing the British colonial army caught in his trap, General von Lettow-Vorbeck could not help but sigh and shake his head as he commented on how easy this victory would be, all while speaking to his second-in-command. "I honestly did not expect them to pursue us to this extent, with little regard for their surroundings. Tell me, my old friend, is their commander an absolute fool? Or are things going so poorly for them in Europe that they feel the need to chase us relentlessly without caring for their own survival, all in pursuit of some vain sense of victory?" The officer second in command to General von Lettow-Vorbeck did not reply directly, but reached back to the phone attached to his radio communications backpack, where he gave the order to open fire first with mortars and artillery, then with a crossfire of machine guns and rifles to thoroughly obliterate the 20,000 British soldiers who had pursued them into the German East African wilderness. "Fire on the enemy position. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. Unleash hell." The British officer tasked with leading the force that outnumbered the German Schutztrupp was a man by the name of Major General Sir Arthur Reginald Hoskins. He was a highly decorated senior officer of the British Royal Army, having served in various colonial conflicts over the past few decades. Among his accolades was command over forces during the Second Boer War. To say he understood the modern battlefield, in comparison to the haughty and foolish old men at the helm of the European theater back home, was an understatement. Even so, his orders were simple: pursue, rout, and destroy the Germans in East Africa should they refuse to surrender. And refuse to surrender they had. Because of this, he was forced to play a game of cat and mouse under the African sun, dabbing his neck, which was sweating profusely, with a handkerchief while he commented on the dreadful climate. I swear, 3 generations of my family could live here, and we would never quite become accustomed to the local weather. I do hope we manage to find the enemy soon, as I would hate to spend another day in this horrific climate. Just as he said this, a mosquito bit his neck. He quickly slapped it with his palm, killing the insect on the spot, all while demanding a ration of medication used to stave off malaria, which the British general feared contracting. "Oi, you there? Yes, you. Break out the quinine. I've had enough of these abominable mosquitoes for one day, and I'll be damned if I get ill because of these damned little buggers." The colonial soldier required translation for the English words spoken to him, a task about to be performed when the thunder of guns echoed in the distance. The moment the British general heard this, he knew it wasn't the weather, it was an ambush. He cried out an order to his soldiers. "My God, get down, all of you." It was too late. A 75mm shell fired by German artillery from within the bush struck almost directly on top of the British general, killing him and his entire command staff in an instant. Afterward, more barges fired by German artillery and mortars struck the British army as they struggled to unhitch their heavy machine guns and field guns from their pack mules. But before they could do so, the pitter-patter of machine guns and semi-automatic rifles erupted across the bush, sealing their fate. Chapter 217, Massacre at Yerevan. Echoes of gunfire rang throughout the city of Yerevan as the screams of Ottoman soldiers accompanied them throughout the distance. At the outbreak of the Great War and the Ottoman Empire's entry within it, the Russians had marched with full force into Ottoman Armenia. Their goal was clear: the liberation of the ancient Christian kingdom, which had for too long been beneath the oppressive thumb of the Ottoman Caliphate. The Russians had initiated the Caucasus campaign at the onset of the Great War, and in doing so had marched into the Turkish lands with a fury that few, if anyone, could have anticipated. Even Bruno would have never guessed just how far-reaching the butterfly effect truly was. In his past life, Russia had more or less always been a backwater power, one that had, for a variety of reasons, always lagged behind the most powerful European nations. This was true even in the Cold War, where the Soviet Union's sole real claim to the status of a global superpower was the fact that they had a nuclear arsenal that could easily destroy the world several times over, especially if exchanged with the weapons of mass destruction which the members of NATO hoarded themselves. The nuclear weapons, however, were largely the achievement of captured German scientists who the Soviet Union had seized after the downfall of Germany during the Second World War. However, as previously mentioned, Bruno had changed things in this world in ways which he never could have understood. As a result of the Russian Civil War beginning over a decade early, and the effectiveness that the Iron Division had against the Red Army during the war, the Russian Empire was completely overhauled over the course of the next decade. Whether it was the end of the Tsar's autocracy resulting in a constitution far more similar to the one used by the German Reich, or the massive industrialization efforts supported by Germany, Austro-Hungary, and, more importantly, Bruno's financial assets, or simply the fact that the field marshal in charge of Russia's army had learned many lessons from his close friendship with Bruno. The Russian army had entered the Great War not as some sniveling backwater force, riddled with corruption, incompetency, and lack of proper funding. Rather, they marched into the Balkans and the Caucasus as the second greatest army in the world. Whether it was the individual equipment they utilized, which included a larger number of heavy machine guns, modernized artillery, armored cars, armored trains, and combat aircraft than their rivals on the global stage, or just simply the efficiency and competency of their leadership, from the levels of non-commissioned officers to the highest staff officers. To put it simply, Russia had begun to live up to its full potential, which was something it had never truly achieved throughout human history. This in itself would be a truly terrifying thought to anyone who had provoked the wrath of the bear under such circumstances. And the Ottomans had done just that. Because of this, the Turks were paying the price. Centuries-long grudges held between them and the Russians were finally being settled, and the consequences of previous hostilities were now being paid in full with blood. Field Marshal Mikhail Alexeyev stood among the scorched ruins of the Ottoman position which his troops had just effortlessly overrun. Turkish soldiers were being rounded up and shot in the streets with little regard to the rules of war. Russia, after all, had always been a nation that had a reputation for disregarding the rules of war, and when fighting against the Turks, they simply pretended as if they were ignorant of such notions. Hogi Conventions? Geneva Conventions? How compelling, now lying against the wall. Then again, Field Marshal Mikhail Alexeyev believed he wasn't the only one who disregarded the rules of war when it suited him. Bruno had earned himself a reputation for massacring enemy armies, and the civilians who were caught in the explosion of his fury. Hence why he had earned himself the nickname, the Red Scourge, during the Russian Civil War, or more recently, the Butcher of Belgrade. If you asked Mikhail what he thought of the situation in Serbia, he would say that he was certain Serbia had most certainly tried to surrender the moment they realized there was no path to victory, and yet Bruno had gassed the city, regardless, most likely burying any evidence of the Serbian government's attempts to surrender as he did so. And if people were not condemning Bruno for the crimes he had rather obviously committed, then how would they dare to condemn him? Because of this, the Russian field marshal flicked the cigarette he had just finished before pulling out his sidearm, which after ensuring a round was properly seated, he pointed the muzzle of his pistol towards the head of the Turkish general who was kneeling in front of him, crying and pissing himself in fear as he begged for mercy in his native tongue. This only further served to aggravate the Russian general, who said a statement filled with contempt and disdain not only for the Ottoman general, but the Turks as a people altogether. "I'm sorry, but I don't speak the language of roaches like yourself." After saying this, Mikhail pulled the trigger, splattering the Ottoman general's blood and gray matter all over the earth below, after which an echo of several more gunshots, which were fired in unison, crackled throughout the sky like thunder. The bodies of over 24 Ottoman officers collapsed into the same mass grave that their general's corpse had fallen into just a moment prior. The Ottoman army, or at least those who had not broken ranks and fled the battlefield, would be thoroughly massacred to the last man and buried in a mass grave outside Yerevan. Only those who confessed to be conscripts of a Christian minority were spared the Russian wrath. And while the massacre at Yerevan would forever be known as a Russian war crime committed against the surrendered forces of the Ottoman army, it had also managed to spare over 1 million lives without anyone other than Bruno being the wiser. The Russian advance into Yerevan, and in the following months the liberation of Armenia as a whole would interestingly enough to prevent the Armenian genocide from occurring, which in Bruno's past life had been perpetrated by the Ottoman Empire and the ruling Young Turks Party beginning in the year 1915. Chapter 218, A Final Admission of Defeat. News of the liberation of Armenia reached the German Reich shortly after the Russians kicked the Turks out of the region. Celebrations were had all over Armenia, where the Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and limited number of Germans who had engaged in the fighting were fully celebrated as heroes of war by the locals. As for the German Reich, it was seen as a major win for Christianity, even if the Armenians were generally of a different denomination. The liberation of Christian lands from Muslim occupation was always a cause for celebration by the devout. And because of this, the Kaiser and his family were also having a feast to honor the sacrifices of those who had fallen in pursuit of this victory for Christendom. By now the Prussian princess had been married off to some duke or another within the German Reich. Was she happy with her marriage? Not exactly, even though she had confessed to Bruno and put her past affections to her, knowing that pursuing her childhood crush was ultimately an act of futility. She could not help but compare her husband to the man she had grown up fancying. And unfortunately, Victoria Lausey was not along in this regard. Both the Tsar and the Austrian Emperor had brought their families to Berlin for the relatively minor occasion, using the Russian victory in Armenia as an excuse to get together and speak of future ambitions, and more importantly debate over war aims. Usually when a war was declared there were obvious objectives that each nation had in fighting it, but as was the case in Bruno's past life, the Great War had more or less come out of nowhere, and the territorial ambitions that each power had was loosely defined throughout the course of the conflict, and in many ways shifted as the years passed. Thus, while the Kaiser, the Austrian Emperor, and the Tsar spoke of such important matters, the princesses gathered to gossip about Bruno's latest achievements, and sulk about how they had utterly lost out on whatever chance they thought they may have had when they were younger to steal him away from his wife. Neither Hedwig nor Olga were yet married, despite being old enough to do so. Even then, after hearing what Bruno had said to the Prussian princess, from the woman's mouth herself, they all sat there in despair, fully realizing that their husband and future husbands would most likely fail to compare to the man they all fancied when they were younger. With Hedwig, being the youngest of the trio, broaching a question to Victoria Louise that she did not quite realize was wholly inappropriate. So, I have to ask, your husband, he's the current Duke of Brunswick, correct? Is he serving in the war? Victoria Louise looked at her old friend, who ironically enough she had grown close to as a result of their mutual friendship with Bruno, as if the woman was a dunce, before outright questioning it to her face. Are you daft, Hedwig? My husband is a duke. Even if he did sign up for the war, he wouldn't be fulfilling a combat role. Every honor he has ever been granted has been the result of his position. That, and the fact that he is technically my third cousin once removed, and thus shares some familial ties to the House of Hohenzollern. I mean, honestly, when was the last time you heard of a duke actually fighting his own battles? Hedwig did not feel slightly insulted by the ruthless banter which her friend gave to her, instead pointing out that there was indeed a nobleman far more prominent currently serving on the front lines of war, and in doing so accidentally, put her foot in her mouth. Well, was it not a fortnight ago that Bruno fought on the front lines in the defense of Belgrade? I have it on good authority that he was personally there in the trenches shooting at the Serbian Provisional Army alongside the soldiers beneath his command, and valiantly defending the city from their attempt to retake it when he did so. Olga quickly facepalmed and sighed as she shook her head. They were trying to avoid talking about Bruno, and yet the Austrian Archduchess had taken the first opportunity to mention him. As for Victoria Louise, she blushed in embarrassment. Not only had her friend rather innocently insulted her husband by refuting her fact that a prominent nobleman had indeed taken up a position on the front lines of war, but the Prussian princess also knew her father was already preparing an Iron Cross First Class for Bruno's successful defense at Belgrade. Because of this, she was quick to lash out at the Archduchess of Austria for her poor choice of words. All right, sure, but he's different. You know what kind of madman he is. For princesses confessed their love to him, and he decided instead to stick with his commoner wife and pursue an early death fighting in war. What kind of madman does that? Luckily for the trio of princesses, Victoria Louise's words had not carried far enough for anyone else to hear her outburst. Even so, they were all both embarrassed and depressed now that they thought about the matter. No matter who they married, how could they ever compare to their Prince Charming, who they all held such high regards for? Unfortunately, it was never meant to be, and ultimately it was Olga who was quick to remind them of this fact. Let's just be happy for him. I mean, the man is finally being given the awards he has long since deserved. I bet by the end of this war he and his family will not only be hereditary princes in Russia, but also in Germany as well. Hedwig was about to say something, but immediately bit her tongue, which luckily for her went entirely unnoticed. Because if she revealed her maternal grandfather's plans to reward Bruno for dispatching the Serbian royal family and the remnants of the Black Hand to hell, there would be serious repercussions for her and her loose tongue. As a result, she remained utterly silent, nodding her head, with a bitter smile on her face as she too admitted defeat, wanting nothing more than for Bruno to soar to the greatest heights and to maintain the platonic friendship she had built with the man over the years. Chapter 219. Invasion of Luxembourg Part 1. Desperation was the mother of stupid decisions. When one felt cornered, they tended to become anxious, and when humans became anxious, they generally did not think through their decisions properly before putting them into motion. And this was the case for the French army and their leadership. It was a tale as old as time itself, or at least as old as democracy. Politicians hid themselves away while starting wars neither they nor their privileged children had any intent to fight. At least monarchs generally fought in the wars they started or they had in years past. In fact, during Bruno's past life, the last national leader to fight in a war was actually King Albert I, who had rallied his forces and fought alongside them in a defensive operation against the Germans at the start of the Great War. In this timeline, however, Belgium continued to remain neutral, as Germany had chosen to fight on the defensive within the Western Front as a result of Bruno's recommendations. This, however, would ultimately not succeed in keeping Belgium out of the war. Because, as Germany had warned Belgium at the start of the Great War, when going through proper diplomatic channels to seek military access in order to strike at France, the French army was not polite enough to afford the same courtesy. The French had, without provocation or prior statement, walked their soldiers into the borders of Belgium and Luxembourg alike, and on the same day no less. The immediate result was Luxembourg calling upon Germany for aid, as the Kaiser had previously promised the House of Luxembourg armed support in the event of a French invasion. As a result, the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg had immediately sent a telegram to the Kaiser asking for his previously promised support. Wilhelm's response was simple. Within the hour, the French invaders will come to sorely regret their decision to invade a neutral nation. The Kaiser also recommended the House of Luxembourg arm any form of resistance they could to buy the German army time to reach their aid. This, in and of itself, was, while common sense, not exactly a practical solution for a small nation like Luxembourg, which did not have an actual standing army. At best, they had 2 companies of what were essentially volunteer units who performed the roles of civil defense and law enforcement. It was not exactly a force capable of opposing a French invasion, nor did they have the arms necessary to create an emergency militia. Thus, for the most part, Leon and his men were able to march through Luxembourg with relative impunity. Years had passed since Leon was first given the rank of General de Brigade, which was the lowest general officer rank within the French army, and he had only recently been promoted at the start of the war to the rank of General de Division. Was a division of 25,000 men overkill when deployed against a nation such as Luxembourg, which could at most field 240 men in defense of its borders? Absolutely. However, Luxembourg was merely meant to be a staging point to attack German borders, which the French had, under a lack of intelligence and wrongful assumptions, presumed their enemy had not fortified due to sharing a border with a neutral nation. So long as the 25,000 Frenchmen could strike at what they assumed was a weak point in German defenses and overcome those presumed lack of defenders, then they could easily march a corps-sized unit straight into the fatherland. Hence why Leon was incredibly smug when he and his men stood within the Luxembourg Palace, staring arrogantly at the current Grand Duchess, Marie Adelaide, who had only turned 20 years old a month before the war broke out. Her father, the previous Grand Duke of Luxembourg, had passed away in 1912 with no sons and 6 daughters. As the oldest of her sisters, Marie Adelaide was the heir presumptive at the time of her father's passing and was coronated as the independent and neutral nation's first female monarch shortly after her predecessor's burial. By all accounts, Marie Adelaide was a rather attractive woman. Having existed in an era before makeup became so advanced that it could magically conceal a woman's imperfections, she had facial features that most men would consider to be appealing. And it was perhaps because of this that there was a mixture of lust included in the smug expression on Leon's face as he demanded the woman's full cooperation. As you can see, Your Highness, the French Republic now controls your petty little monarchy. Frankly speaking, I think it would be in your best interest to treat me, your new overlord, with a bit more respect and grace than you have shown toward me up until this point. Being friendly with your occupiers is simply a matter of common courtesy, no? It was not as if the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg wasn't aware of who Leon was. The French had, after all, made a big deal about the man and his supposed abilities as a military commander. Rumor had it he was the Republic's answer to the Wolf of Prussia. But upon meeting the man in person, Marie Adelaide could not help but show the French general nothing short of disdain. Even her gaze toward him was as if he were beneath her in every manner. And this was not some snobbish noble attitude. Rather, she truly felt that Leon was a lowly creature, one undeserving of the reputation he seemed to have. Because of this, she rather fearlessly chided the man for his ill-earned reputation as a capable commander. Am I supposed to believe that a little rat like yourself is somehow the equal to the Wolf of Prussia, a man who, in his mid-20s, routed the Russians at Port Arthur and annihilated their army in Mukden, only for a year later to march a division of volunteers into the Russian heartland, breaking the siege at St. Petersburg and hounding the Reds across the Siberian landscape, sniffing them out, and tearing them apart down to the last man. A general so capable that he smashed half of the Serbian army at their border within the first hours of your so-called Great European War, only to annihilate what remained of their forces at Belgrade less than a month later? What, pray tell, have you, General, done that is remotely so terrifying as to equal the butcher of Belgrade in terms of command and ferocity? Your sole claim to fame is that you massacred a few uppity savages in Madagascar, and that somehow earned you the infamy you allegedly possess? Allow me to be frank, General. Even if you invade my lands and occupy my home, there is nothing you can do to force me to concede my family's lands to you. You are simply undeserving of such an admission of defeat. Leon was not a man known for his composure, and because of this, his face turned ugly just a moment before his hand struck, slapping the Grand Duchess violently across the face and knocking her to the ground as he did so. Even so, she did not squeal in agony like a common pig. Not a sound escaped her lips as she wiped the blood from her mouth, cursing the Frenchman in her own native tongue, which he could not comprehend. Knowing that she had insulted him, Leon lifted the woman up and screamed in her face while practically foaming at the mouth. "What did you just say to me, you fucking whore?" The Grand Duchess of Luxembourg simply smirked smugly as she once more spoke in perfect French, so the fool knew exactly what she had said about him. "I said you hit like a little girl." The Frenchman raised his open palm once more, prepared to strike the woman, when an explosion rocked the foundations of the palace. This was followed by the echo of gunfire, which tried to shoot down the German bombers in the sky above Luxembourg, but failed miserably to do so, as the French machine guns and rifles severely lacked the range capable of such a feat. A French soldier instantly rushed into the room, with a shaken appearance, almost as if he had seen something horrible. He was covered in blood and dust as he informed his commanding officer what had happened to him. "Sir, our front line. It's gone." Leon, having thought he heard the most absurd thing in his life, let go of his grip over the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, forgetting all about his wrath toward her as he laughed at the words that were spoken to him by his subordinate, almost as if he had completely misheard. "Gone? What do you mean, gone? You're telling me the brigade I sent to secure the eastern border of the city is gone? What do you mean, gone? Gone as in deserted? Gone as in moved forward with our plans to secure the German border? Gone how? Spit it out, you fool." The soldier quickly overcame the shell shock he was suffering from as he informed Leon of what exactly had happened to their forces and how the Germans had so quickly punched through into the city. "Sir, the 1st Brigade has been completely annihilated, down to the last man. The Germans have begun to encircle the city and are using armored cars to protect their troops from our gunfire in their advance. If we do not retreat now, we will be surrounded within the hour." Leon could hardly believe his words. He was not aware of any armored car that could remotely be used as a shield to soak up bullets for the infantry behind them. Then again, the armored cars of the era were made of inferior steel riveted together at angles that were easy to penetrate. The same could not be said about the German armored cars, which until now had remained undetected by French intelligence and had primarily been utilized in the field of reconnaissance. Leon naturally had a hard time comprehending his current reality because of this. But, ultimately, he was forced to make a decision: stand and fight against a German division armed with air support and armored cars, or retreat from the city of Luxembourg and take up a line of defense further in the west. In doing so, allow the Germans to effectively occupy the most strategically important region of the Grand Duchy. Time was of the essence, and Leon did not know how to decide at that moment. 220 Invasion of Luxembourg Part 2. Time was running out, and Leon had two options. How he chose to proceed with his current circumstances would determine the future of his and his men. If he stood his ground and tried to defend the city against the German division which was currently encircling them, then there was a high chance of defeat. However, if he chose to retreat back out of the only real region of strategic interest within the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, then Leon was not only admitting defeat, but would be forced to fight on the defensive going forward, risking total expulsion, and thus failing to achieve the goals he had been tasked with by the French High Command, who were more or less panicking at the moment. Standing and fighting was a major risk. He had already lost his veteran brigade, who were the most capable forces under his command. and it was unknown how many losses precisely the German relief force had suffered. But if they were using armored cars as shields for their infantry, then there was a high chance that the losses they sustained were substantially smaller than those his men had already endured, meaning that at this moment, he was more or less numerically disadvantaged. With this in mind, Leon wisely chose to withdraw from Luxembourg so that he could live to fight another day, glowering at the Grand Duchess as he ordered his men to organize a retreat. "We have no choice. We will fall back from the city temporarily and establish a front line farther back towards our own borders. Once we have reinforcements, we will retake this city." The Grand Duchess of Luxembourg cast Leon a smug grin as the man snarled like a beast while he and his men withdrew from the woman's palace, which they had been until now occupying as if it were their property. Marie Adelaide sighed in relief while watching the French army issue a full retreat and pull out of her city altogether just in time for the cavalry to arrive. German soldiers rode into battle on the backs of the armored cars which strolled into the city. The camouflage netting and paint schemes only slightly fettered and dinged from the bullets, which struck their slopped hulls. The Grand Duchess made a rather inappropriate comment to one of her younger sisters who had been by her side as Leon threatened them all. "I have never before in my life been so happy to see a bunch of armed German men enter my home. Shall we go thank our liberators for the swiftness of their aid?" Marie did not wait for her sister's response, and instead rushed out of her palace into the courtyard to greet the men who had come to her aid. The officer in charge of the armored brigade, which acted as the vanguard in the German division's assault, quickly took off his Stahlhelm and bowed before the Grand Duchess as he was merely a common man. "Your Highness, I must apologize for the tardiness of our arrival. It took longer than we anticipated readying the armored cars for the advance into Luxembourg, but as promised, we are here to prevent the French from occupying your territory for as long as you request our presence. I hope that you and your people remained unharmed from the hostile soldiers we have just driven out." The Grand Duchess was rather pleased with the German colonel's attitude. He was treating her with far more respect than Leon had, and was even apologizing for the length of time it took for him and his men to arrive, which was far faster than she had expected. It was reasonable for this to be the case. The Germans advanced into Luxembourg on the backs of armored cars and within the cargo beds of 3.5-ton trucks. It was no exaggeration to say that they had moved with the swiftness of a proper motorized division during a time where horses and forced marches were the primary means of transporting troops. Of course, the Grand Duchess was marveling at the machines of war which had brought the German soldiers into her home, almost awestruck at the expert engineering that went into them. It was not a luxury that the Luxembourgish gendarme could afford, and because of this she couldn't help but gaze upon the Spa-Panzers as if they were some form of alien technology. It took Marie Adelaide several moments to realize she had remained utterly silent, and awkwardly so, prompting her to immediately thank the German officer again while asking what his plans were for the future. "There is truly no need to apologize, but I have to ask, how do we proceed? Am I to expect you and your men to stay here and protect Luxembourg for the duration of the war? Now that the French have seen fit to violate my sovereignty and invade my home without even the slightest declaration, I can't help but feel we are truly helpless without the Kaiser's aid." Before the colonel could answer this question, another man arrived, having been driven in the back of a military vehicle created by Bruno's Volkswagen Corporation known as the Kubelwagen. The man was dressed in the uniform of a general lieutenant. The German general was quick to answer the question with a smug look on his face. "For the time being, my men will reinforce our position here in your city, while I sent a few brigades to go chase those French rats out of your territory. Once all of Luxembourg has been liberated, we will dig in at your borders and hold the line against the aggression of your western neighbors for as long as you request of us." Upon hearing this news, the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg was truly relieved. She, of course, would not have been so if she fully understood the implications of calling upon the German army for aid. But because of her ignorance, she treated the men who were more or less here for the sake of annexation as if they were liberators and heroes rather than conquerors. "You have my thanks, brave defenders of Luxembourg. If not for you all, and the kindness of your Kaiser, I fear Luxembourg would have been destined to become yet another province of the French Republic." Naturally, None of the German soldiers were going to tell the woman that she had more or less just been tricked into giving up her sovereignty to the Kaiser, but discussions for official annexation could wait until the war was over. For now, the German army needed to prepare proper defenses in the event of another French attack, as it was entirely likely that the French general was calling for reinforcements now that he and his men had been violently driven out of the city. Thus, the general immediately began to relay such orders to his men. While he spoke in more detail about their current operations with the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, Leon was rather furious. Though he and his men had just barely managed to break out of a total encirclement by the German division, they had left behind their objective in coming into Luxembourg to begin with, and had more or less retreated back towards the borders of France with nothing but the death of their men to show for their efforts. It was no secret that the leaders of the Allies were starting to panic. In every front currently being fought, they had lost the initial engagements with the imperial powers. Even in the colonial theater, they had been trounced by the Japanese and the Lion of Africa. The public would not support such substantial losses for long. The French needed a victory, and Leon had planned to be the one to give them that. Unfortunately, the German army had managed to outpace him and his men. By the time they had seized the capital of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, the Germans were already on their way and in full force. A division of men, where the vanguard was equipped with armored cars, had dealt a considerable blow to the French invaders. The fact of the matter is, the only thing capable of dealing a fatal blow to one of these advanced armored vehicles was a direct shot from an artillery piece. And they had been caught by surprise when the Germans came out of nowhere, rapidly firing 20mm high explosive shells at their barely fortified positions. But when his superiors learned of what he had done, there would be hell to pay. Another loss in a series of disastrous defeats was not what the French were expecting when they invaded their neutral neighbor without warning. And this only further gave them a reputation on the world stage as an aggressor. Luckily for France, Leon's invasion of Luxembourg was met with a far larger offensive launched into Belgium for the same result. And the French were currently engaging a battle with the Belgian army, which it was looking like they would emerge the victors of. But Leon did not know this fact. And since that was the case, he could not help but vent his rage in the way he always did by harassing the men beneath his command and blaming them for his failures. Chapter 221. Volunteering for the Vanguard. Reinforcements had arrived halfway through the second month of the war. Bruno had spent the previous 2 weeks clearing the minefields he had set around the city of Belgrade and the trenches dug outside its perimeter. How does one efficiently clear a minefield? Well, Bruno already had the answer to this. Introducing the Minenraumwagen, as Bruno called it, stealing the name from his past life, was about the only thing inspired by its previous iteration. The vehicle was more or less a Panzer chassis based on the E-10 paper tank designs from Bruno's past life, but with a mine flail attached to it. However, there was one other thing this armored vehicle had in common with its predecessor: the fact that it was remotely operated via radio signature. Bruno had invested in a number of the world's greatest geniuses over the years, allowing for this tracked mine-clearing armored vehicle to exist without risking life and injury to a crew that would otherwise have to pilot it. And it was because of this that he could send these mine-sweeping vehicles into the minefield with no regard for their well-being and, in doing so, whip every single mine into detonation with the attached mine flail. Sure, it took a considerable amount of time and, most importantly, resources, but it was well worth the expenditure. Bruno had meticulously mapped out the exact placement of each mine during the construction of the city's defenses, and thus he had a precise ability to locate and destroy the devices that, if left alone, could render the area uninhabitable for God knows how many decades. By the time the Austro-Hungarian and Russian troops finally arrived to reinforce Bruno and his men, they were surprised to see how the German forces were covered in grime. Despite the current state of the German soldiers, they were far from exhausted. After all, much of the heavy lifting had been done by the mine clearers. Even so, gazing upon the once thriving metropolis that was the capital of Serbia, now turned into a ghost town at Bruno's command, forced a sense of melancholy on the Austro-Hungarian and Russian generals, especially since the fog had not truly cleared since the massacre unfolded. With it being autumn, and the weather quite dreadful at the moment, it all compounded into a haunting atmosphere. one which the German army had endured throughout the weeks since they gassed the city into submission. Bruno appeared to be the only one unaffected in the slightest by the ghastly ambience. The same could not be said for the soldiers under his command, who were slowly but surely unraveling at the seams. Rumors of ghostly wails being heard during the heaviest storms and at the devil's hour did not help the dreadful morale afflicting Bruno's troops. Hence why the Austro-Hungarian general was quick to comment on the current state of affairs while Bruno smoked in the rain in front of him. Your men seem unnerved. Have the battles you fought already begun to affect them so? Bruno shook his head, quickly answering the man with a grim statement before narrowing his eyes and interrogating the Austro-Hungarian general for his tardiness. Not in the slightest. When the gunfire begins, their hands are as steady as finely tempered steel. Rather, it's the spirits of the dead that cause them to lose sleep. No matter how much I try to tell them, the ghosts of the departed have no earthly power to harm them. Some of the more superstitious men swear they have seen things in the mist and heard voices at ungodly hours of the night. It's all nonsense. Such things do not exist in this world. But after what we did to this city and the people in it, I don't blame some of the men for breaking down. Hence why I'm glad you're here. A change of scenery would do them some good. Speaking of which, why are you so late? We took care of the Serbians that you routed and expected you to arrive at any given moment. Yet here you all are, 2 weeks after the battle. The Austro-Hungarian general instantly averted his gaze with a guilty expression on his face, causing Bruno to more or less guess what had happened, which the Russian general was quick to admit. Apologies, sir. They were waiting on our arrival to join forces and march into Belgrade together. After the losses they sustained in their conflict with the forces of the Serbian Provisional Army, they felt it would be safer to travel with greater numbers. Had we known the state your men were in, and the fact that this dreadful environment was affecting them to such a degree, we would have hastened our approach and been far less cautious in our advance. Please forgive me for wasting so much of your time. Bruno scoffed after exhaling the last plume of smoke his cigarette could offer. He then discarded the device before stomping on it. Not that, with the current torrential downpour, it was remotely capable of lighting a wildfire ablaze. He simply did this to vent his frustration silently rather than verbally lash out at his allies. The man was forcing himself to remain calm despite the circumstances he found himself in. Losing his emotions, especially now when his troops were in a state of borderline despair, was the last thing he needed to do. Instead, Bruno pointed out just how costly the Austro-Hungarian and Russian cautious march had been. Simply put, by now the British and French have docked in the Balkans, either in Montenegro, Albania, or Greece, and carried some much-needed weapons and munitions to their Serbian allies, creating a much larger problem for us than we would have faced had you not taken 2 whole weeks to reinforce us. In fact, I would not be surprised if the Allies have sent aid in the form of troops to Serbia as well. Now we are going to have a much tougher fight on our hands. And if Serbia's neighbors throw their lot in with the Allies, this theater could last an entire year rather than a mere 3 months as I had anticipated it would. Luckily for me and my men, who have done the majority of the fighting up until this point, you have both volunteered your forces to fight in the vanguard within the next major battle we come across. So, on behalf of the German army, I humbly accept your apologies. Rejecting Bruno's assertion that they make up for their lack of haste and determination by sending their men into the front lines of the next assault was not exactly a wise decision. For starters, Bruno had been granted operational authority over the Balkan theater after being promoted to the highest rank in the German army. Sure, the Austro-Hungarian and Russian generals might also be of a similar rank and status, but Bruno was, at the end of the day, the man with sole authority over everything the imperial powers did in this campaign. Hence, all they could really do was accept responsibility for their failures and agree to send their own troops into the first wave of the next major battle. Chapter 222, The Angel of Berlin. In addition to making sure those children affected by the war within the imperial powers were properly taken care of should they lose their parents, or that the widows and their children were also given aid to support them without their husbands around to look after them. Heidi's charities also expended significant amounts of resources and personnel looking after those physically wounded in battle. German soldiers naturally received priority, but if there were enough room in the field clinics and hospitals, then Austro-Hungarian and Russian soldiers were also treated. The invention and mass production of life-saving antibiotics, such as penicillin, had done wonders to fight infections, severely decreasing the number of amputations that would have been medically necessary to stop the spread of otherwise lethal diseases. In addition to this, the adoption of suitable footwear for the conditions of the trenches prevented the outbreak of fungal infections and other nasty conditions such as gangrene and trench foot that, if not treated properly, could lead to the loss of the affected limb or worse, death. While Bruno had been almost entirely focused on producing the tools needed to kill as many of his enemies as possible and win the war, Heidi was the one who reminded him that Germans would suffer as well and would need ample preparations to mitigate casualties. All things considered, Germany was currently sustaining the least amount of deaths, as those who could be saved generally were because of what Heidi had done to prepare for the war. As a result, both Bruno and Heidi had gained reputations as angels and were depicted as such in wartime propaganda. There were just two distinctive roles which they served, and they were opposite to that. If Bruno was the living incarnation of Azrael, the angel of death who led millions of souls into the afterlife, then Heidi was the personification of Raphael, the one who healed those who had come to harm, and in doing so preventing her dark counterpart from reaping their souls. Heidi was not just the one coordinating the efforts to save as many lives as possible. When she could manage the time, she would visit the soldiers who had been brought back to the fatherland for one reason or another and give them a friendly smile and her personal thanks, letting them know that the world had not come to an end and that the people they were protecting were extremely thankful for the sacrifices they had made. One of the men who she was speaking to knew exactly who she was. He had, after all, served beneath her husband at Belgrade and was injured during its defense after the Germans had gassed the residents into extinction and occupied the ruins left behind. The man had been injured enough that he was extracted from the battlefield and sent back to Berlin after his treatment was over, to be properly cared for and rehabilitated. Frankly speaking, he had an enormous amount of respect for Bruno, but he was suffering heavily from what he and the army did at Belgrade. His wounds weren't just physical. His mind was scarred in ways that were difficult, if not impossible, to treat. And because of this, he couldn't help but feel like venting his frustrations with himself to the woman of the man who had ordered the army to massacre an entire city. "You're Heidi, right?" Heidi von Zehntner, the wife of the General Feldmarschall. Heidi instantly looked over at the man who was lying in one of the sick beds. She didn't understand who he was or how he knew her. After all, there were many soldiers being treated in Berlin from various different theaters of war. Because of this, she instantly paid the man her full attention as she pulled up a stool and sat down in front of him. Her face was friendly, so much so that the man who had wanted to yell at her and blame her for how he was feeling couldn't manage to feel any anger within his heart, especially when she spoke to him in the kindest of tones, one in which he simply wasn't expecting. "That's right, you know my husband?" The soldier nodded his head. Whatever words he had thought of saying to Heidi the moment he saw her enter the room had instantly evaporated. He didn't even think as he confirmed that he indeed knew Bruno, albeit not on a personal level, as he was just an enlisted man barely old enough to fight. "I do. I was attached to the 8th Army before this happened." Those were the only words Heidi needed to know to fully understand the young man's situation. By the look of confusion in his eyes, he was at Belgrade when Bruno gave the order to massacre the city, and because of this, she had an empathetic gaze in her sky-blue eyes as she spoke to the man as if she genuinely cared about his pain, which she did. You were at Belgrade, weren't you? You poor soul. I can't even imagine what you are going through right now. What my husband did was cruel, in more ways than I think he is even aware of. Not only to the innocent citizens in the city who paid for the actions of the Serbian royal family unnecessarily with their lives, but also to you all who had to carry out and witness the attack which Bruno ordered. How are you holding up, if you don't mind me asking? Men were, in many ways, rather simple creatures, when the world was unraveling around them, and they were questioning themselves and everything else in life. All that was really needed to prevent them from going totally insane was to know that someone, somewhere, cared. Even if they didn't personally know the person, the fact that somebody would show them kindness in their darkest hour was more than enough for most men to suffer silently and endure whatever pain they were going through, at least enough to move along. And because of this, the young man, who had felt a series of confusing and conflicting moments until Heidi sat down and talked with him, came to terms with what he had done in an instant, at least enough so to steady his heart and mind, so that he could continue on, not only fulfilling his duty until the end, but also with life in general. Thus, he wore a bittersweet smile, as he confessed to Heidi how exactly he was feeling in that moment. You know what? I think I'm going to be fine. Chapter 223, Acting Man of the House. Aside from the influx of wounded men heading on trains towards hospitals safely behind enemy lines, the Reich was more or less operating similarly to how it had been during a time of peace, or at least as far as everyday life was concerned for civilians. The war was going smoothly so far for the imperial powers, and why wouldn't it be? They had prepared for many years for this conflict, and had prepared in ways that were most appropriate. If there was one thing Bruno was most concerned about, it was the fact that he was not an active part of his children's lives at this point. All he could do was send them letters from the front whenever he had the time to do so, and the means to transport them back to the fatherland. And because of this, his older children, who were entering their teenage years, were, for the most part, left without a father to properly guide them through this critical period of their development. Eva, in particular, had a hard time, as she received word constantly from the girls in her school of their brothers coming back from the war wounded or, worse, in body bags. At least half of her class had at least one member of their family who had been affected by the ongoing global conflict, and because of this, the young teenage girl was quite worried about her father's safety. In addition to this, as the eldest child, Eva was more often than not aiding her mother, performing the role of her father by helping to be a second parent for her younger siblings. If it were just Heidi, her, Erwin, and Bruno, things would have been easier. But over the course of the last 4 years, since Heidi and Bruno first decided they wanted to have more kids, they had produced as many children as solar rotations that had occurred. This meant Heidi and Bruno were currently at 7 children, Eva being the oldest, Erwin being the second oldest, and Elsa being the third. However, currently, Eva was home from school, taking the day off as her mother had work affairs to tend to. Could Heidi have left the raising of her children up to their villa's staff? Most certainly. Would she ever let her children run wild without the supervision of at least one von Zehntner being present? Like hell. Because of this, Eva was home, looking after her younger brothers. Of the second crop of 4 children, 3 had been born sons, and 1 had been born a daughter, who was the current youngest of all of Bruno and Heidi's kids. Currently, Eva was smacking the face of the eldest of the 3 younger boys, Joseph, while scolding him for running around with mud all over his feet. His actions, of course, inspired his 2 younger brothers to do the same, causing a massive mess to appear. Joseph, Heinrich, and Wilhelm, I swear to God in heaven that if you don't take off your muddy shoes right now, there will be hell to pay when mother comes home. With his face having just been slapped with a wooden spoon by his eldest sister, Joseph immediately began to pout and cry, throwing the tantrum of a lifetime as he stomped his muddy shoes all over the carpet. To say Eva had enough of her little brother's collective shit was the understatement of a lifetime, and her face turned stern as she was just about to curse them in the most unladylike and reprehensible way possible. Luckily for her, Erwin stepped into the room and saw the massive mess, having just returned home from the academy as he witnessed what his younger brothers had done, cursing up a storm as if he were a soldier in the trenches as he did so. Oi, you little fucking shits. Did you create this fucking mess? You better answer me when I'm asking you a goddamn fucking question, or I swear to Christ I will fucking tell the old man all about this matter when he gets home from the Balkans. And you know how that miserable old bastard handles things. Eva misunderstood which parent her brothers feared, which was the opposite of her and her sisters. While Heidi was especially strict and tyrannical with her little girls, her sons she did nothing but dote upon. And the opposite could be said about Bruno. Hence why she didn't threaten the younger boys with their father's fury, as the man had seldom shown such a fierce side to her or her sisters. Thus she was slightly surprised when the young trio stripped off their shoes and socks before snapping to attention and bowing their heads with a formal apology. Please forgive us. Of course, Erwin knew exactly the punishment their father would have in store for him had he done something so outrageous, And because of this, he instantly gave the three young boys a list of chores to conclude, of which only Joseph was remotely old enough to handle the most minute of tasks without proper help from the family's staff. You little brats are going to be cleaning up the mess you made, and I don't care how long it takes you. If I hear for a moment that you slack off and force the maids to do the majority of the work, I will have you paint the manor's fucking walls. Alia just so happened to be walking in when watching Erwin scold his little brothers, as if he was channeling the energy of his absent father, causing her to chuckle at the sight of the young teenage boy struggling to emulate the behavior of a proper mature adult. She walked up behind Erwin and petted his golden hair while mocking him in front of his siblings, something which Eva found to be utterly distasteful from her older god-sister. There, little man, don't be too harsh on the little tykes. They are just children, after all. They probably don't even know any better. Tell you what, how about you and I help them out so we don't make a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be? Erwin's cheeks turned slightly rosy as he looked away from his older fiancée, too embarrassed to say a word. Meanwhile, Eva instantly clenched her fists and pouted, interrupting her younger brother before he could agree to Alia's request by latching onto his arm and dragging him off. I'm sorry, Alia, but Erwin promised to help me with something today. If you want to help the little brats clean up the mess they made, you can do so yourself. Come on, Erwin. Erwin was at a loss for words. He had no recollection of making such a promise to his older sister and even questioned her as he was forcefully dragged off by the girl. Wait, Eva. Hold on. Alia simply pressed the palm of her hand to her cheek and commented on the whole ordeal rather fondly, which only caused Eva to pout and stick her tongue out at the younger woman as she rounded the corner with Erwin. Oh my, isn't that adorable? She's so jealous. Chapter 224. Responses to German Advantages. The Great War spread across the world quite rapidly. It wasn't really surprising when you really thought about it. After all, the majority of the world was currently owned by the great powers. There were few independent nations outside of Europe that remained. However, one of those independent nations was the Empire of Japan, and they were perhaps the only non-European nation in history who had more or less kept up with the level of development of the European empires, so much so that in the first half of the 20th century, they were capable of challenging them to some degree, something that nobody else on the global stage was really remotely adequately prepared for. It was true that by 1945, Japanese technological development had completely and totally lagged behind their allies and rivals on the global stage. But in 1914, they were more or less on par with the European great powers, having access to most of the same level of military equipment. Recoil-compensated artillery? Check. Bolt-action rifles? Of course. Heavy machine guns? Absolutely. And thanks to Bruno's intervention in the timeline, the Imperial Japanese Army also had access to general-purpose machine guns. Granted, many of these weapons were chambered in the relatively anemic 6.5x 50mm Misar Arisaka, as it was relatively lacking in power compared to contemporary cartridges of the era. However, in the 21st century, the 6.5 times 50mm Misar Arisaka would more or less be redeemed in the eyes of ballistic experts, as it had more than enough power to take down a man-sized target in a very flat trajectory, which was something desirable among shooters. Considering in the 21st century, the 6.5 by 48mm cartridge became favored among competition shooters for this very reason. Bruno actually advised the Japanese to stick with this round rather than develop an unnecessarily larger cartridge, like they had done in his previous life, and in doing so strained their supply lines. It was honestly a testament to the capability of the cartridge that the world's first battle rifle in Bruno's previous life was chambered in the 6.5x 50mm Misar Arisaka. While many would argue that the Russian Fedorov Avtomat was the world's first assault rifle. The weapon, which was initially manufactured in limited numbers in 1915 and used more extensively in the Russian Civil War than during the preceding Great War, did not technically meet such a definition. As an assault rifle was defined by militaries across the globe as a rifle chambered in an intermediate cartridge, which had select fire capabilities. This, of course, meant that the Fedorov Avtomat, which was chambered in a full-sized rifle cartridge and not an intermediate cartridge like the 8x33mm Kurz utilized in the Sturmgewehr 44, was, by definition, a battle rifle instead. A battle rifle had virtually the same definition as an assault rifle, but with the slight variation of using a full-sized rifle cartridge instead. This was a rather important detail to mention, as the Russians were currently developing this very rifle as a means to compete with the German Gur 43 or Gur 05, as it was called in this life, that Bruno had forced into the timeline much earlier than it would have normally occurred without his interference. But who wasn't trying to come up with a solution to advanced German weaponry that was currently dominating the battlefield? The Austro-Hungarians were more or less in the process of creating a rather simple, cheap, and effective conversion of their Steyr-Mannlicher M95 straight-pull rifles into a semi-automatic variant. Meanwhile, the French were desperately trying to replace their abysmal French Pudos Model 1905 machine guns with something far more reliable and durable, as they had foolishly invested heavily into the mass manufacture of such weapons as a means to compete with the overwhelming number of Maxim machine guns the Germans displayed during the Russian Civil War. Only now, after the war had begun, had the French begun to understand the folly of their hasty actions. The only machine gun within their service was incredibly prone to jamming under field conditions, or, worse, suffering catastrophic malfunctions and failures in battle that required extensive repair to get back into action, something which could not be done outside of an arms factory. Something that resulted in excessive casualties, as the French army simply could not support their charges against fortifications with suppressing fire, resulting in massive waves of their men being mowed down by superior German weaponry. It was admittedly an absolute embarrassment for the French as a nation. And while they were actively trying to fix this massive problem in their arsenal, the British and Italians were also working on their own focuses. The Royal Navy had suffered catastrophic defeats on the seas and had begun circumventing Normandy, and instead landing in southern France and the Balkans with their troops to avoid being hunted down by German wolf packs focused in the North Sea. However, the British had misunderstood what kept sinking their ships. Not understanding the threat which lurked below the waves, they instead believed that the Germans were sinking their vessels with air power, and thus their focus became towards rapidly developing anti-aircraft weaponry capable of defending their navy and maritime trade. The only nation that was truly concerned with German submachine guns and light machine guns were the Italians, who had suffered repeated and horrific losses in the Alps because of the overwhelming number of MP-34s and MG-34s which the Germans wielded, both of which were mobile enough to rapidly defend any corner of the fortifications built within the mountain range from Italian assaults. It truly did not matter how rapid of an advance the Italians mobilized, as the Germans could simply mobilize their men with the most rapid rate of fire to counter their charge at any given moment, something that was simply not possible with heavy machine guns. It was also something the Italians realized was a glaring gap in their own armed capabilities. Each front proposed a variety of unique difficulties for the adversaries of the German Reich, difficulties which even Germany's allies picked up on and were trying to fix in their own arsenals. Thus, while the Germans had the overwhelming technological outbreak at the start of the war, if they were not prudent and simply rested on their laurels, it was entirely possible that by the end of it their enemies could have caught up to them. Something that Bruno would have to keep an eye on if he wanted to guarantee a victory in this new timeline. He found himself reincarnated into 35 years ago. Chapter 225, Reactions to Bruno's Rise. With William Howard Taft being elected to the position of U.S. President, a man who was beholden to his donors within the America First Committee, which itself was a lobbying group designed by Bruno to keep the United States out of the war, the United States and its official stance on the Great War was one of pure neutrality. Unlike in Bruno's past life, they did not even attempt to provide material aid to the Allied powers, believing that any attempt to get involved, even indirectly, was a dereliction of their patriotic duty and a violation of the founding fathers' vision for the nation. To put it simply, the United States maintained open trade with nations from both alliances, while neither favoring one nor the other in any official or unofficial capacity. Meanwhile, newspapers printed the ongoing happenings of the war. One such story was currently being read by the President of the United States, William Howard Taft, who smirked at the photograph of the trenches outside Belgrade, which was just beneath the sensational headline, "The Wolf of Prussia is rewarded for his defense of Serbia." The article then went on to explain Bruno had been awarded the Iron Cross First Class for his victory over the Serbian Provisional Army at Belgrade. It also stated that, due to his position on the front lines, Bruno had yet to receive the honor but would be given it personally by the Kaiser the next time he entered a state of leave. However, the mere mention of the moniker, the Wolf of Prussia, caused the American president to sneer. It was one of 3 nicknames used by the West to refer to Bruno. The fourth, however, was a name Bruno was only called by the Japanese. It was also the epithet generally used by those with a more favorable disposition toward the German general. The term Butcher of Belgrade was almost always spoken in reference to Bruno by those who hated him. Meanwhile, the Red Scourge was commonly found among the ranks of anti-Marxist circles. The very use of the term showed that the author of the article was probably highly biased toward Bruno, and it was a nickname commonly used by media outlets in the United States, something the American president found curious. Tell me, James, what do you think of this so-called wolf? I'm starting to get the feeling that the Germans have more influence over our society than they reasonably should. Until now, the favorability toward Bruno within the American media had reasonably been explained by the significant minority of German immigrants in the United States, as well as their descendants, who were natural-born citizens. As for the man Taft addressed, he was the current Vice President of the United States, James S. Sherman. Sherman was a man descended from the American founding father Roger Sherman, who signed the Declaration of Independence, as well as the Union General William Tecumseh Sherman, known for lighting the South ablaze in his March to the Sea. If there was such a thing as American nobility, he was most certainly a member of this privileged class. It was only natural that the man would have some sort of sixth sense when it came to matters of politics. Because of that, he pushed his glasses forward before speaking his thoughts on the matter asked of him by his running mate. To put it simply, I think there is a very high likelihood that the media is conspiring in some way or another with the German Empire to keep us out of the war. That being said, I don't think it would be wise to investigate further. After all, we were elected under the promise of remaining neutral. So unless the Germans do something incredibly foolish like attacking our nation and its people, I would suggest not kicking the hornet's nest, as they would say. Don't you think? Taft couldn't help but put the paper aside as he sat back in his seat. He had a comfortable expression on his face as he explained his thoughts on the matter. Wars being waged across the Atlantic are no concern of ours. So long as we can profit off the Europeans and their utter madness, I see no reason to pick a side. Wouldn't you agree, my friend? A silent nod from the vice president confirmed his agreement on the matter. Because of this, they chose to simply watch the war from afar and not care in the slightest about Germany's attempts to influence American sentiment toward neutrality. In the entire history of mankind, there were 4 nations that had neither been colonized by Europeans nor subject to their influence, whether in totality or in part. Those 4 nations were Japan, Korea, Thailand, and Liberia. However, this was also misleading, as the Japanese had colonized the Koreans before the Europeans could get their hands on it. Liberia was more or less under the protection of the United States during the scramble for Africa. The United States itself was a nation founded and created by European colonists and their descendants, thus really meaning there were only 2 nations on the list of 4 spared from being subjected to the influence of a great power. Of these 2 nations, only one was a minor power, the Kingdom of Siam, which would later become known as Thailand. Thailand was a neutral country, or at least it was currently in 1914. After all, they were heavily influenced by both sides of the Great War and were on relatively good terms with both. That being said, European interests in the region and aid in the development of the Southeast Asia Kingdom weren't necessarily out of the goodness of their hearts. A series of unequal treaties had been signed between Siam and the great powers of the world. While significant territory in Southeast Asia had been ceded to France and the UK during negotiations that only finally concluded in 1909, settling the nation's borders as they currently were, the current king, Rama VI, decided to ultimately stay out of the war altogether. However, whispers of the Germans and their barbaric ways of conducting warfare had begun to reach his ears, specifically from the king's foreign minister, who was an Anglophile, and this caused Rama VI great concern regarding the ongoing war. Because of this, he decided to reach out to one of the 48 German nationals employed within the Siamese government and inquire about whether he was being lied to by his uncle. Naturally, the German nationals were quick to defend Bruno's actions at Belgrade, stating the official story of how the Serbian royal family was composed of usurpers who had assassinated the previous king and his wife to gain their position and were in league with the Black Hand and Young Bosnia, thus being partially responsible for the outbreak of the war. After a lengthy story pointing out how Bruno had been forced between besieging a heavily fortified city and marching his soldiers through its streets, where they would have to engage in brutal urban warfare against armed soldiers and civilians alike, or simply gassing its inhabitants, Rama VI was forced to believe that getting involved in the war was a very, very bad idea. When, at its outbreak, such a horrific choice had to be made by one of the generals fighting it, Siam's neutrality was sealed. Thus, inadvertently, Bruno had continued to change the timeline with his actions, ensuring that the Kingdom of Siam would not enter the war in 1917 on behalf of the Allies like it had done in his past life.